Hello, and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting an exciting new series. What if female Deku became demon? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Random Bullshit 9 on Wattpad. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now let's dive into the story. It was a stormy night when Izumi Midoriya went into LBR. Rain lashed against the windows of the hospital, the wind howling like an unseen specter outside. Nurses whispered uneasily about the unnatural chill that filled the DLVRY room, their skin prickling with goosebumps. The lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The doctor reassured Inko, speaking in soothing tones as she struggled through the pain. She barely registered his words, too lost in the agony of bringing her child into the world. She had dreamed of this moment for months, imagined holding her baby in her arms, their tiny fingers curling around hers. It was supposed to be appealing. It was supposed to be joyous. But when the wailing cry of her newborn finally pierced the air, the room was silent. There was no joy, no celebration, only horror. The doctor froze, his breath hitching as he looked down at the newborn girl in his hands. The nurses took a step back, their faces paling, hands trembling as they muttered prayers under their breath. Inko forced herself up, her body screaming in protest as she reached out. "My baby! Let me see my baby!" No one moved. Then, slowly, the doctor turned and placed the child in her arms. The moment Inko looked upon her daughter, her BLD turned to ice. The infant was not normal. Her skin was deathly pale, almost sickly in its unnatural whiteness, as if she had never been touched by warmth. Wisps of pitch-black hair clung to her small head, but it was her eyes that sent dread crawling down Inko's spine. They were open, wide and piercing, but not the soft green she had expected. They were yellow, a sickly, burning gold, glowing faintly even in the dim light. The pupils were black slits, inhuman and predatory. The moment their gazes met, Inko felt it, a terrible, suffocating fear wrapping around her like chains. Her breath hitched. Her heart pounded erratically against her ribs. It felt as though she were staring into something unholy. The baby did not cry anymore. She simply stared at her mother, silent and unmoving, as if she understood the fear she inspired. Then the shadows in the room began to stretch. The darkness from the corners slithered toward them like living tendrils, flickering and twisting unnaturally. The lights dimmed, and an unnatural cold swept through the space. The nurses gasped, one of them stumbling back into a tray, sending instruments clattering to the floor. The doctor made a choked noise, gripping the hospital bed for support. And then, as suddenly as it came, the presence was gone. The lights returned to normal. The shadows stilled. The air warmed. But the damage was done. One of the nurses whispered hoarsely, her voice barely above a breath. She's cursed." Inko clutched her daughter tighter, her hands trembling. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to believe that this was just a misunderstanding, that her little girl was just like any other child. But as she looked into those unnatural, piercing eyes that belonged to something far older and darker than a newborn, she realized a horrifying truth. Her daughter was not just different. She was something else. The days following Izumi's BRTH were filled with silence. Inko never spoke of what had happened in that DLVRY room, nor did she acknowledge the fear clawing at her heart whenever she looked at her daughter. She tried to hold her, to love her, but the moment those unnatural, glowing yellow eyes met hers, the warmth in her chest was drowned by cold terror. The baby did not cry like other infants. She did not wail in hunger or discomfort. She simply watched, her golden gaze unblinking, as if she understood the world far too well for a newborn. Shadows in the apartment seemed to stretch unnaturally when she was near, and an eerie silence always followed her presence. At first, Inko tried to rationalize it. She told herself it was just a quirk, an unusual one, but still just a quirk. Then the nightmares started. Every night, Inko dreamed of a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, its face obscured but its presence suffocating. She would wake to find her daughter staring at her from the crib, those glowing yellow eyes burning in the darkness. She couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't be the mother of something so wrong. One cold evening, wrapped in a heavy coat, Inko carried the bundled infant through the quiet streets of Mizutofu. The child did not stir, did not make a sound, as if she already knew what was to come. Inko's grip on the baby tightened as she approached the looming silhouette of an old church. The Holy Trinity Orphanage stood at the edge of the city, run by devout nuns who took in abandoned children, raising them under strict religious guidance. It was a place of DSBLN and devotion, where the light of faith was meant to wash away all darkness. Yet, as Inko stepped toward the large iron gate, an unsettling feeling crawled up her spine. The church itself was old, its stone walls weathered and worn, but it was the silence that unnerved her the most. The candles flickering behind the stained glass windows barely pierced the growing darkness of the evening. A lump formed in her throat. Was this truly the right choice? She looked down at her daughter, her Izumi, who stared up at her with those golden, haunting eyes. A shiver ran down Inko's spine. The air around the baby seemed colder than the night itself. This was the only way. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward and rang the bell by the orphanage door. Moments later, the heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing an elderly nun in a black habit. Her face was worn with age, but her sharp blue eyes held a wisdom that had seen the worst of humanity. Sister Agatha, she introduced herself, looking down at the bundled child in Inko's arms. Her expression remained unreadable. "How may we help you, my child?" Inko hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she slowly extended the baby toward the nun. Please, take her." Her voice cracked. I can't. I can't do this. She's not normal." Sister Agatha's eyes darkened. She peered down at the baby, and for a brief moment, something flickered across her expression. Recognition? Fear? It was gone in an instant. The silence stretched between them. Then, with a sigh, the nun reached out, taking the child into her arms. "What is her name?" Inko's lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. She had called her Izumi, but somehow in this moment, the name felt foreign, like it did not belong to this child. Finally, she whispered, "Izumi Midoriya." Sister Agatha nodded. "The Lord welcomes all children, no matter how lost they may be." Inko swallowed hard, forcing back the tears threatening to fall. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps unsteady, her heart pounding against her ribs. She did not look back. As the heavy doors of the orphanage shut behind them, Sister Agatha glanced down at the silent infant wrapped in white cloth. Izumi was still staring. And for the first time in many years, the old nun felt a cold dread settle deep in her bones. The moment Izumi Midoriya crossed the threshold of Holy Trinity Orphanage, a presence settled over the old church like an unseen fog. Sister Agatha was the first to notice it. The halls, once filled with the distant echoes of children's laughter and prayer, grew eerily quiet in the child's presence. The candle flames in the chapel flickered erratically whenever she entered, bending away from her as if repelled by an unseen force. The wooden crucifixes that adorned the walls creaked. In the night, some falling from their nails with no apparent cause. Izumi herself remained silent through it all. Unlike the other infants, she did not cry, did not fuss. She simply watched. The other nuns avoided her when they could, whispering behind closed doors about the cursed child left in their care. Some believed she had been born with a malevolent quirk. Others murmured that she was an ill omen, an unwanted soul marked by something far darker than mere genetics. And then there was her shadow. At first, it was subtle and odd flicker, a slight distortion when she sat alone in her crib. Sister Agatha dismissed it as a trick of the dim candlelight. But as the months passed, it became undeniable. Izumi's shadow did not always match her form. Sometimes, when the light was just right, it stretched too far, creeping unnaturally along the floor, its edges frayed like ink bleeding into the stone. And on nights when the storm winds howled through the old church, the nuns swore they saw something else lurking in the child's silhouette, something tall, gaunt, watching. By the time Izumi was 4, the nuns had come to fear her. She had grown into a quiet, pale child with deep black hair that framed her small face. Her golden eyes remained unchanged, glowing faintly in the dim candlelight, unnatural even for those born with a quirk. But it was her shadow that terrified them the most. One night, as Sister Agatha tucked the children into their shared dormitory, she paused by Izumi's bed. The girl was already lying down, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Her tiny hands clutched the old blanket, her expression unreadable. The nun sighed. She had tried to be kinder to the girl than the others had been. She is just a child, she reminded herself, though the cold pit in her stomach argued otherwise. Good night, child, she murmured, brushing a trembling hand against the girl's forehead. Then she turned to leave, and froze. The candle by the bedside flickered violently, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. And there, cast against the far side of the room, was not the shadow of a 4-year-old girl. It was something else, tall and impossibly thin, draped in what looked like a tattered, flowing habit. Its face was elongated, sunken, its mouth stretched into something that was almost a grin. The edges of its form writhed like smoke, as if it were not entirely there. Sister Agatha's breath hitched. Slowly, her eyes darted to the child beneath the blankets. Izumi had not moved, had not reacted, but the moment the nun looked back at the wall, the shadow turned its head toward her. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as she stumbled back, clutching the cross that hung from her neck. The air grew colder, the candlelight nearly snuffing out. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow snapped back to its proper form, retreating into the small frame of the child. The room was silent once more. Izumi turned her head toward the nun, her glowing golden eyes locking onto her with an unsettling awareness. She blinked slowly. Sister, her small voice finally whispered, almost innocent. Sister Agatha swallowed, her throat dry. Go to sleep, child. She turned and left the room, not daring to look back. That night, she did not sleep, and neither did Izumi. As the years passed, the tension within Holy Trinity Orphanage grew. No one could deny the presence of Izumi Midoriya, nor the chilling effect she had on the other children. Despite her quiet demeanor, an unspoken fear hung over her like a thick fog. At 5 years old, Izumi had already mastered the art of silence. She moved like a shadow herself, slipping through the halls of the orphanage unnoticed, her golden eyes gleaming in the dark corners of the building. The other children avoided her, their whispers barely audible behind closed doors. They spoke of her as if she were a ghost, a specter, something that did not belong in the warmth of the orphanage's walls. But there was something else, the thing no one could ever quite put into words. It was in the way Izumi walked, her posture always slightly off, as if something unseen was always beside her, guiding her steps. The other children had long since learned to ignore her, but there was one thing they couldn't escape, her shadow. No matter where Izumi went, her shadow moved differently. It had grown darker, more erratic over time. It was no longer simply a reflection of her movements. It acted on its own, twisting and slithering in unnatural ways. Izumi's only friend was the dark. At 5, she began to speak to it. She would sit in the corners of the room, her eyes glowing softly as she watched her shadow stretch across the walls. It was almost like a game, a conversation without words, but one that only she could hear. The nuns would sometimes catch glimpses of her muttering to the floor as she ran her fingers over the shadow on the ground, her small voice quiet but unmistakable. "Where are we going today?" she would whisper, her golden eyes never leaving the shape on the floor. "The dark is nice tonight, isn't it?" Sister Agatha had grown accustomed to the strange behavior, though it unsettled her more each passing day. She tried to dismiss it as a child's imagination, but something inside her told her that Izumi's shadow was more than just a figment of fantasy. It was a presence that seemed to be growing stronger. By the time Izumi was 6, the shadow began to take on more shape. It no longer merely followed her, but reacted to her movements. Sometimes it would stretch across the walls like long, jagged fingers, reaching toward whatever it desired. Other times, it would coil tightly at her feet, darkening the floor around her. Izumi's conversations with her shadow became more frequent, and though the shadow could not speak back, she seemed to understand it in a way no one else did. "Why do you keep hiding?" she would ask. "Don't be afraid. I can see you too. You don't need to stay in the dark." The shadow responded in ways only Izumi could comprehend. The air would grow colder around her, the darkness thicker, as if something were trying to make itself known. But as she got older, the answers became clearer. At 7, Izumi began to notice more than just the shifting shadows. She could feel them, feel the presence that hovered just beyond the reach of the light. It was not just her shadow that answered her now. "It's almost time," she would say softly, as though talking to an old friend. "Is it ready?" The shadow twitched, a brief ripple that sent a wave of chill through the room. Her golden eyes flickered in the darkness as if awaiting a response. The nuns had noticed the change. Sister Agatha, who had spent years trying to protect the children from the growing unease surrounding Izumi, began to pray more fervently. She asked the Lord for guidance, for a way to purge the malevolent aura she sensed around the child. But the other nuns were not so sure. They saw the signs, how the shadows followed Izumi, how the room would darken when she entered. The whispers spread, and the fear only deepened. At 8, Izumi's behavior became even more unsettling. She began to smile at her shadow, wide, toothless smiles, grinning as if it were a game only the two of them played. The air around her grew colder with each passing day. The nuns spoke of taking her to the priest, but it was clear that no prayer would remove the dark energy clinging to the child. And then, at 9, the shadow spoke. Not with words, but with movement. Izumi sat alone in the dormitory one night, watching the flickering candlelight as it danced along the walls. Her shadow stretched across the floor, growing and curling like a living thing. Izumi's golden eyes locked onto it, and she smiled. "I knew you were ready," she murmured, her voice soft but filled with anticipation. The shadow responded. It shifted, its edges twisted in a way that was almost human, stretching upward until it took on a familiar form. A long, gaunt figure, towering over Izumi, its hands stretched outward, its body trailing like tattered cloth. The child's smile deepened. "You're here. I've been waiting for you." In the flickering candlelight, the shape of the shadow became clearer, its presence heavier. It was no longer just an extension of Izumi. It was something more, something alive, a form, a shape that only she could see. It was only a glimpse, but it was enough. The shadow of the thing Izumi would one day become was now undeniably, unmistakably real. By the time Izumi reached the age of 10, the atmosphere around Holy Trinity Orphanage had shifted completely. The once quiet whispers had transformed into fearful murmurs that filled the cold stone halls, their subjects always the same: the child with golden eyes and a shadow that was not of this world. Izumi herself had grown taller, though her physique remained slender and pale, almost ethereal. She had begun to speak less. The words she did utter often laced with a darkness that unsettled the nuns. Her once innocent smile had twisted into something sharper, her voice cold and distant, as though her soul were no longer entirely bound to her body. Her transformation had begun, albeit slowly. The dark energy around her had expanded, but it was still contained, for now. It seemed as if her power, her true form, was waiting for something beyond the orphanage's oppressive walls. But one fateful night, at the age of 12, Izumi's transformation would come to fruition. It was a stormy evening, the kind where the wind howled like a creature in pain and the sky cracked open with violent thunder. The nuns were gathered in the chapel, praying for protection, for guidance, for anything that might rid them of the curse they had so long feared. And in the dormitory, Izumi lay in her bed, staring up at the ceiling with those unsettling yellow eyes, her body taut with anticipation. She had sensed it. The darkness within her was stirring, The power she had been slowly awakening was rising to the surface. Her shadow twisted on the floor. Izumi closed her eyes, a smile forming on her lips. It's time. Without warning, her body arched violently. The air grew heavy, the room colder than it had ever been. Izumi's form trembled as her body began to shift, her limbs elongating, her bones cracking like dry branches under the pressure of an unseen force. Her fingers turned into twisted claws, and her skin, once pale, began to take on an almost translucent sheen. But the most terrifying transformation was yet to come. Her face contorted, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Her eyes glowed even brighter, now burning with a demonic intensity as her pupils turned into inky slits. Her long, black hair whipped around her, floating as though caught in an invisible wind. Her once soft voice distorted into something guttural, something monstrous. And then, like a dark figure from a nightmare, she stood. Izumi was no longer the girl she had been. She was something far worse. She had fully transformed into the demon that had been lurking within her all along. Her face was now a twisted, skeletal visage, framed by long, matted black hair. Her eyes were burning yellow orbs of pure malice, and her lips curled into an eerie, toothless grin. Her body was clad in a tattered habit, long and flowing, reminiscent of a nun's garb, but corrupted by the dark forces she embodied. Her long, bony fingers twitched as her claws extended, and the air around her seemed to warp in response. She had become Valek, the demon she had always been destined to become. Outside the dormitory, the nuns could feel it, the shift in the air, the heavy, oppressive darkness that pressed against the walls. A chill so deep it seeped into their bones. They hurried to the children's quarters, their voices laced with concern and prayer. But as they approached Izumi's room, the door slammed open on its own, and they found themselves face to face with the grotesque creature standing in the center of the room. Sister Agatha froze, her BLD running cold. She knew. She had seen the signs, felt the cold touch of evil creeping closer. But seeing it in its full form, seeing the demon that Izumi had become, was more than she could have ever prepared for. "Izumi," Sister Agatha whispered, her voice trembling. The demon's head tilted slightly, the grin on her face widening. There was no recognition in those glowing yellow eyes, only malice, only hunger. Then, in a voice that was no longer human, the demon spoke. "You should have left me to the dark, but now you've come to witness what you should have feared." The nuns gasped, backing away slowly, but one among them, Sister Clara, stepped forward, holding a silver cross in her trembling hands. "By the power of the Lord, I command you to leave," she cried, raising the cross toward Izumi's transformed form. The air around them grew even colder, the room plunging into an unnatural frost. The shadow that clung to Izumi began to writhe and slither, a dark mass of shifting tendrils and eyes, twisting like it was alive. But then, something unexpected happened. As the silver cross neared Izumi's face, a loud screech erupted from her throat, an inhuman, agonized sound that rattled the very walls. The demon recoiled, her eyes flickering with a sudden, intense pain. Sister Agatha's eyes widened in realization. "Silver," she whispered under her breath. "Silver hurts it." But the shock did not end there. Sister Clara, panicking, poured holy water from a small vial onto Izumi's twisted form. The liquid sizzled as it made contact with her skin, the scent of burning flesh filling the room. Izumi shrieked again, her form contorting in agony, her once solidified body flickering between its monstrous form and the fragile human shape she had once inhabited. "No," the demon hissed, her voice deep and feral. "No more." The holy water had weakened her. The silver had burned her. It was clear now. Izumi, the demon known as Valek, had one true weakness: holy symbols made of silver and true holy water. Sister Agatha stepped back slowly, her heart racing. She had no idea how to stop the monster that stood before her. How could one fight something that was both child and demon? The answer felt impossible, but she knew that whatever this creature was, whatever it had become, it could not be allowed to remain. Izumi's yellow eyes flickered one last time with the briefest hint of recognition, almost as if the child inside her was still trapped. Then the demon bared its teeth, eyes burning with hatred. "Foolish humans," Izumi's voice snarled. "You think you can stop me?" And just as quickly as it had appeared, the demon vanished back into the shadows, leaving the nuns standing in stunned silence. The days after Izumi's transformation into Valek were shrouded in an oppressive silence. The air in the Holy Trinity Orphanage had thickened, growing colder and heavier, as though it too felt the looming presence of something unspeakable. For the first time in years, the nuns found themselves unable to offer any comfort to the children, who now seemed to sense something darker was at work, though they could not understand what had truly changed. Sister Agatha and the others tried desperately to pray, but nothing felt the same. Their chants, their desperate pleas to God, seemed to fall on deaf ears as they attempted to reconcile what had happened that night. What they had witnessed was a demon, and worse, one that had once been a child they had sworn to care for. The very foundation of their faith was crumbling beneath the weight of the horror that now clung to the orphanage. But what no one had realized was that the culling had already begun. It started subtly at first, small things that might have been dismissed as accidents, as unexplained misfortune. The nuns would awake to find objects moved, rooms turned upside down, the crucifixes on the walls askew. The candles flickered with strange intensity, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to shift of their own volition. But it didn't take long for the truth to reveal itself. A week passed after the transformation, and the first disappearance occurred. Sister Clara, the youngest of the nuns, had been the first to notice that a child was missing. Little Benjamin had gone to bed the night before with a quiet cough, but by morning he was nowhere to be found. She searched the orphanage with increasing panic, but there was no sign of him. The windows were locked, the doors bolted. It was as if the boy had simply vanished in a thin air. The other children seemed unfazed, almost unnervingly so. They said nothing, offered no questions, just as they had grown used to the strange occurrences surrounding Izumi. That night, Sister Clara heard strange noises coming from the hall. She thought it was Benjamin, perhaps sneaking about or causing trouble, but when she peered into the dark corridor, her BLD ran cold. There, standing at the end of the hall, was Izumi, or rather Valek. Her form, shrouded in a dark, tattered habit, towered over the nun. Her eyes burned with an unnatural yellow light, glowing in the dark like twin lanterns. Her skeletal grin stretched impossibly wide, her teeth sharp and jagged, and the cold air around her seemed to pulse with malevolence. Sister Clara froze, unable to move as the demon's head tilted at an almost unnatural angle, its gaze fixed upon her. "You shouldn't have stayed." Valek's voice rasped, distorted with malice. Before Sister Clara could scream, Valek moved. She was faster than any human, her form becoming a blur in the dim light. The nun's feet seemed rooted to the floor, too terrified to run. In the blink of an eye, Valek was upon her, her bony hands gripping Sister Clara by the throat. The demon's cold, twisted fingers tightened around her neck, choking off any sound. Sister Clara's eyes widened in fear, her hands scrambling at the creature's grip, but it was no use. The darkness itself was pressing in on her, suffocating her as the demon's smile grew ever wider. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the shape of a child in the distance. Benjamin's body, suspended in the air, his small form twisted and lifeless, caught in the dark power of Valek. The next morning, the other nuns discovered her body. Her throat had been crushed, her eyes wide with terror, and her expression frozen in a look of sheer agony. But what was more chilling was the eerie calm that followed. No more screams, no more panic, just silence. The second disappearance came a few days later. Sister Agatha herself, already fraught with dread, had been unable to sleep. Every night she had heard the whispers, the faintest of footsteps in the halls, the soft scraping sound of something, or someone, scratching at the walls. But it wasn't until she heard the laughter that she realized it was not her mind playing tricks on her. The laughter was faint but unmistakable, a hollow, eerie sound that echoed from the far end of the orphanage. Sister Agatha grabbed her rosary, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been prepared to confront Izumi, to confront whatever had taken hold of her, but nothing had prepared her for the horror she would find. She followed the sound of the laughter, her steps faltering as the air grew colder. She could feel the weight of something watching her, an unseen presence pressing down on her chest. She stepped into the dimly lit hall, and there she saw it. The shadow of Valek stretched along the walls, no longer just a distortion but a dark, looming figure. Izumi's face, twisted into the demon's horrific grin, was half-formed, flickering between the child she had once been and the thing she had become. The demon's eyes gleamed with pure, unfiltered hatred as it watched her approach. Then, without a sound, it reached out. But this time, it wasn't for Sister Agatha. At the far end of the hall, the third nun, Sister Rosa, was standing frozen in place, her hands clutching a prayer book as if she could ward off the monster with words alone. Her mouth moved, silently reciting prayers, but Valek's cold, knowing smile only grew. The air grew thick with dread. Sister Rosa let out a choked cry before she was dragged into the shadows, her body lifted off the ground as though pulled by unseen strings. Her limbs flailed, but she was helpless, trapped in the grip of the demon, pulled closer to the darkness that surrounded Izumi's twisted form. And then, she was gone. By the end of the month, no one remained untouched. One by one, the nuns were picked off, disappearing without a trace. Their bodies were found later, mutilated and strung up in places that defied logic. On the walls, suspended from the rafters, hanging like puppets, their faces twisted in eternal terror. Izumi's power, the demon Valek, grew stronger with each life taken, her malevolent force expanding as she consumed all those who had once called her child. The remaining children of the orphanage, once carefree and innocent, now lived in constant fear, their eyes wide with terror, watching the shadow of death take hold of them one by one. They had no way of understanding what was happening, only that they were trapped in a place of unimaginable horror, the walls closing in on them with each passing day. Izumi had become something unstoppable, and soon there would be no one left to stop her. The final days at Holy Trinity Orphanage were marked by an unbearable silence, broken only by the distant, hollow cries of the children and the occasional scuffle of feet echoing through the darkened halls. The once holy sanctum of God's love and protection had become a place of torment, the air thick with the stench of decay and despair. The nuns who had once lovingly cared for the orphans had been picked off one by one, their bodies serving as grim reminders of the demon that had been unleashed upon the world. And now, only one remained. Sister Agatha, the oldest of the surviving nuns, had witnessed the massacre unfold over the last few weeks, and she knew that the end was drawing near. She had clung to hope, to the belief that there was still something human within Izumi, something that could be saved, but the child she had once known was long gone. What stood before her now was nothing more than a vessel for something ancient and malevolent. Izumi, or rather Valek, had slaughtered the others with terrifying precision, always slipping back into the shadows before anyone could get a full glimpse of her. The demon had become more brazen as the days passed, moving in plain sight, taunting Sister Agatha with her very presence. The once familiar child's face was now a grotesque reflection of death, the skeletal grin widening with each kill. Sister Agatha had tried everything, prayers, incantations, holy water, but nothing had worked. The demon seemed impervious to the very symbols of God's power. Every attempt to strike back had only resulted in more pain, more destruction. And now, the time for prayers was over. On the night of the final confrontation, a storm raged outside the orphanage. The winds howled through the broken windows, sending curtains fluttering like ghostly figures in the wind. Lightning cracked the sky, casting fleeting shadows across the blood-stained floors. Sister Agatha stood at the altar of the orphanage's chapel, her hands trembling as she held the last remaining silver cross. Her rosary hung loosely from her neck, and her eyes were fixed on the door. She knew Izumi was coming. She could feel it. The darkness had reached its peak. The chapel door creaked open slowly, the sound a haunting prelude to the inevitable. Izumi stepped in, her form barely visible in the dim light. The pale glow of her yellow eyes shone through the darkness like burning embers, casting an unholy light across the room. Her hair floated around her like tendrils of shadow, and her grin stretched impossibly wide, exposing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Sister Agatha swallowed hard but stood her ground. She lifted the silver cross in front of her, her voice weak but determined. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this place. You are not her. You are not Izumi. You are a demon, and you have no place here." Valek's eyes narrowed, and the demon's grin twisted into a predatory smirk. "You still believe in the child? She is gone. Only darkness remains." The air around them grew colder, the shadows lengthening, distorting into grotesque shapes. The demon's voice echoed throughout the chapel, reverberating off the stone walls, growing louder with each passing second. Sister Agatha felt the weight of the dark energy pressing in on her, suffocating her. Her knees trembled, but she refused to bow. She had to end this. For the children. For Izumi. "Please," she whispered, clutching the cross tightly. "I beg of you, leave this place and return to the void where you belong. You don't have to be this." Izumi tilted her head, her expression mockingly sympathetic. "I don't have to be this. You think I chose this?" She stepped forward, her footsteps echoing with an unnatural force, the shadows growing darker around her. "You should have left me to the abyss when you had the chance. Now you will witness the end." Without warning, she lunged. Her claws shot out, sharp as daggers, and Sister Agatha barely had time to lift the cross in defense before Izumi's hand grasped her throat. The power behind the grip was immense, and the cross burned with holy light, but it did nothing to stop the demon's advance. Sister Agatha gasped for air, her vision blurring as the demon lifted her off the ground. Her hand scraped weakly at Izumi's wrist, but there was no escape. "No more prayers," Valek hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "No more hope." With one swift motion, Izumi snapped Sister Agatha's neck, her body going limp in the demon's grasp. She dropped the lifeless nun to the ground with a dull thud, her yellow eyes fixed on the cross that had fallen from Sister Agatha's hand. For a moment, there was silence. The air seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something, anything, to break the spell of dread that had settled over the chapel. Then, Izumi, the demon known as Valek, took a step back, looking around her. The orphanage was dead. It was time to end it all. With a flick of her wrist, Valek summoned the power that had been growing within her. The walls of the chapel began to tremble, and the very foundation of the orphanage groaned as if it were alive, its structure crumbling under the weight of the demon's power. The stained glass windows shattered, raining down shards of colored glass, and the ceiling above began to crack, sending debris tumbling to the floor. Sparks of dark energy surged through the room, and the chapel began to collapse. The walls twisted, warping into impossible angles, as if the very space itself was being bent by the demon's will. The shadows in the corners of the room grew deeper, reaching out like long, hungry fingers. In one final, devastating roar, the entire orphanage was consumed by darkness. The walls crumbled away into nothingness, the floors cracked and split, and the roof shattered into 1,000 pieces. The once pristine walls of the orphanage were reduced to rubble, the dust and debris swirling around like a storm as the foundation of everything the nuns had worked for was obliterated. As the orphanage collapsed into ruin, Izumi, Valek, stood amidst the destruction, her form flickering between the demonic figure she had become and the child she had once been. For a moment, There was a flash of something faintly human in her yellow eyes, but it was gone in an instant. The storm outside raged on, and with one last, haunting scream, Izumi disappeared into the darkened shadows, leaving only silence in her wake. The orphanage was no more. The children, the nuns, the fragile remnants of the past, all reduced to nothing but dust and memories, consumed by the power of the demon. Izumi's dark journey had only just begun, but the world would soon come to know her name. Valek, the demon of shadows, the demon of death. And she would leave nothing but destruction in her wake. It had been days since the destruction of the orphanage. The townspeople spoke in hushed whispers, their eyes filled with fear and disbelief. No one had seen what had happened. No one except for the children who had been taken in by the authorities. They were too terrified to speak, too shaken to offer any answers. But one thing was clear. The Holy Trinity Orphanage was gone, reduced to rubble by an unknown force, and the nuns and children who had lived there were all dead or missing. Among the survivors, there was one name on everyone's lips, the orphan who had been abandoned and left to die, the one who had somehow escaped the fire, the one they feared had become something else entirely. Izumi Midoriya. No one knew where she had gone, but one thing was certain. Something had awakened within her, something dark and terrifying. The same thing that had destroyed the orphanage was now stalking the streets of the city, leaving a trail of bodies in its wake. It began slowly. At first, the disappearances were subtle, almost imperceptible. A merchant found dead in a shop, a child gone from the park without a trace, a couple of workers found hanging from the rafters in their own homes. The authorities had no leads, no clues, just the cold, lifeless bodies of victims who had been torn apart in ways they couldn't explain. The strangest thing was that there were no signs of forced entry, no apparent struggle, and no clear motive. The only consistent detail was the gruesome state of the bodies, eyes wide with terror, faces contorted into expressions of pure agony. They were always left in places that felt wrong, as though they were meant to be discovered, meant to send a message. But there was something else, something even more unsettling. Witnesses who had been close to the scene spoke of shadows that moved against the light, of a figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, of a strange presence that made their BLD run cold. It was always described as a woman, tall and gaunt, with pale skin, glowing yellow eyes, and an impossibly wide, skeletal grin. It was as if the very air around her became heavier, suffocating, the world bending in her presence. Rumors spread. Some said it was the ghost of a child who had died tragically. Others whispered that it was a demon in disguise, one that had come to punish the world for its sins. But no matter how the story was told, the fear was the same. A new terror had come to the city, and no one knew how to stop it. In the Hero Commission headquarters, the panic was palpable. Pro-heroes from all over the country had gathered to discuss the mysterious killings, and the situation had grown dire. The task force led by Toshinori Yagi, All Might, was the first to respond, his face a mask of concern. His once powerful body had grown frail with age, but his sharp mind still made him one of the top strategists in the hero world. "This doesn't make any sense," All Might muttered, scanning the report. "We have bodies, but no clear pattern, no witnesses. It's as if this person, whoever they are, knows how to evade us completely." "Could it be a villain?" Endeavor asked, his voice cold and stern as ever. His fiery gaze narrowed as he studied the case files, looking for any signs that might point to a quirk user. "A vigilante or a rogue hero, maybe?" "Maybe," All Might replied, his expression darkening. "But there's something different about this. The way the victims are killed, the fear they show, it feels unnatural. Almost like something out of a nightmare." "You're not wrong," Ryuki added, her sharp eyes scanning the reports as well. "The victims have all been left in a state of sheer terror. It's not just the manner of their deaths, but the way they were positioned. It's like they were displayed. A message, but what is the message?" As the heroes discussed their next move, the Public Safety Commission was busy investigating the strange and horrific phenomena. Reports of shadowy figures and unnatural occurrences were flooding in from across the city. Several people had reported seeing a tall, ghastly woman lurking in the shadows, but by the time they called for help, she was always gone. However, there was one consistent detail that all the witnesses shared: a feeling of being hunted. The feeling of something lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And always the victim's last words had been the same: the eyes. Meanwhile, in the darkened alleyways and abandoned buildings of the city, Izumi, Valek, continued her killing spree. The streets were her domain now. The shadows were her allies, her strength. And the people who dared to cross her path were nothing more than prey to be hunted. She had no need for elaborate plans or motives. She took what she wanted when she wanted it. Her victims never saw her coming. In the dead of night, she would appear, her figure flickering in and out of the darkness like a ghost. The shadows around her would twist and writhe as if alive, and her yellow eyes would pierce through the night, glowing with an unnatural light. She was more than a mere murderer. She was an entity born of darkness itself, a thing that fed on fear and suffering. Her first victim of the new spree was a local reporter, a man who had been investigating the deaths from the orphanage. His curiosity had led him into a trap, and now his body would be just another piece of evidence that would point to her. He had gone missing the night before, and his body was found in an abandoned warehouse the next morning. His neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The message was clear. The hunt had begun. Izumi had learned to enjoy this. The fear, the power, the terror that she instilled in the hearts of those who dared to question her. Her demon form, Valek, was unstoppable now. The heroes, the authorities, they were nothing more than obstacles in her path. She would tear down everything in her wake. But as she moved through the shadows, she could feel something stirring deep within her, a presence that she hadn't noticed before, a presence that wasn't her own. The heroes were closing in. They had started to piece together the clues, and they were beginning to recognize the pattern. They were starting to realize that the one responsible for these killings wasn't just a person, but something far more dangerous, a creature born of the darkness. Izumi smiled to herself. Let them come. She would show them that no one could stop her. The city was hers now, and soon the entire world would tremble at the name of Valek. The body count was rising, and with it, the growing sense of dread in the city. Heroes scrambled to make sense of the killings, but the pattern remained elusive. The victims were being torn apart, their lives extinguished in gruesome ways, yet there was no clear rhyme or reason behind their deaths. At least, until now. It was Ryukyu, one of the sharpest minds on the task force, who first saw the strange detail. She had been reviewing the crime scenes once more, trying to find any shred of coherence in the chaos. The bodies were always displayed in such a way that it seemed deliberate, as if they were meant to be seen to send a message. The police had only been able to identify them as a random assortment of victims, but something caught Ryukyu's attention. She called the others over to her station in a frenzy. "Wait a minute," she murmured. "Look at this. These bodies, they're positioned in a way I haven't seen before." All Might leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the screen. "What do you mean?" Ryukyu scrolled through the photos of the crime scenes. The victims, like always, were torn apart, their faces twisted in terror. But there was something more this time. The bodies weren't just discarded. They had been carefully arranged, each in a distinct shape. "See the pattern?" she asked, pointing to one of the crime scenes. The first victim, a local shopkeeper, was arranged in a shape resembling the letter V. The second victim, a journalist, was arranged in an A. The next, Ryukyu clicked through the images quickly, revealing the horrific setups. A woman was contorted into an L, a man's arms placed at odd angles to form an A, and another body was bent in such a way that it mimicked the letter K. "Wait a second." All Might's voice was thick with realization. "Is this a name?" Ryukyu zoomed out on the screen to show the entire set of letters. The gruesome arrangement of bodies, when put together, spelled out Valek. "Valek," Endeavor muttered under his breath, his gaze turning cold. The name of a demon. It fits. She wants us to know. All Might said, his voice grim. She's showing us who she is, what she's become. This is no coincidence. Ryukyu looked at him, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The bodies are still being left in the same way, but this time, she wanted us to understand. She's toying with us. The heroes exchanged a tense silence, the implications of this discovery heavy in the air. This wasn't just random chaos, it was a message. But for what? Why had Izumi chosen to spell out her name in BLD? What did she want to prove? We need to prepare, All Might said quietly. She's playing with us. If we don't act fast, there may be more bodies waiting for us. Elsewhere, Izumi, or rather, Valek, watched from the shadows. She had been tracking the heroes' movements, enjoying the way they had scrambled to piece together the clues she had left behind. But the game was far from over. The fear they felt as they searched for her. That was what she fed on. She smiled, her mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. She had spent days meticulously positioning the bodies, crafting the puzzle of her name. But it was only a brief diversion. The hunt continued, and now she could see that the heroes were beginning to understand. But they were still too slow, still too weak. That night, the killings resumed, and with them, the dread that clung to the city like a dark fog. This time, Valek was done with the cryptic games. She would go back to what she knew best, killing without rhyme or reason, killing to feel the rush of power. She moved silently through the streets, the shadows her domain, and the night her cloak. Her first victim of the night was a man walking home from a late shift at a factory. He never saw her coming. One moment, he was walking through the empty streets. The next, a cold chill ran through him. His breath caught in his throat as a figure flickered in the corner of his eye, a tall, twisted silhouette that seemed to move in and out of the shadows. Izumi was there before he could react. She appeared behind him in the blink of an eye, her pale face inches from his as she leaned in close, her yellow eyes glowing like twin embers in the night. He opened his mouth to scream, but it was too late. A clawed hand shot out, wrapping around his throat like a vice, cutting off his air supply. He kicked and flailed in vain, but the grip was too strong. His body jerked with each attempt to break free, but Valek's strength was unstoppable. Slowly, deliberately, she crushed his windpipe. When he was dead, she tossed him aside like a rag doll, his lifeless body crumpling to the pavement. His face was frozen in terror, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream that would never escape. She grinned. It was too easy. Her next victim was a young woman who had been on her way to meet a friend. She walked quickly down the alley, not realizing she was being followed. Valek watched her from the darkness, her presence so cold and suffocating that the woman felt a sudden unease, as though the world around her had shifted. The woman turned around, her eyes scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. She continued on, shaking off the feeling as she quickened her pace. Then, in a flash, Valek was behind her. The woman barely had time to react before a cold, bony hand shot out and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her off her feet. She gasped in shock, trying to scream, but Valek's hand covered her mouth. With a swift motion, Valek spun the woman around, pinning her against the brick wall. The woman struggled, but it was no use. Valek's eyes gleamed with malice as she tilted her head, savoring the moment. Slowly, she drew a long, jagged claw across the woman's neck, the BLD spilling out in a hot, sticky stream. The woman's last breath was a gurgled cry as she slumped forward, her body crumpling to the ground. Valek stood over her, watching as the life drained from the woman's eyes. For a moment, she almost felt something, but it was fleeting like a whisper in the wind. Without a second thought, she turned, vanishing into the shadows as the city screamed in terror. Back at the Hero Commission, the situation was worsening. They had no leads, and the bodies were piling up. The discovery of the cryptic messages had given them only a brief moment of clarity, but it was slipping through their fingers like sand. They knew they were getting closer to finding Izumi, but she was still slipping through their grasp. Every death, every body left behind, was another reminder. Valek was playing a game they were destined to lose. The night had fallen cold and heavy over the city, a thick fog rolling in from the river. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It was the kind of silence that preceded something terrible. And in the heart of the city, something terrible was waiting. Ryunosuke Matsuoka, a young pro-hero known as Tempest, had been patrolling the streets on the hunt for the killer that had been terrorizing the city for weeks. Tempest had an elemental quirk, allowing him to control the wind with his movements, creating powerful gusts and storms that could knock opponents off their feet. He was a versatile fighter and had been known to handle even the most dangerous criminals. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he felt as though the air itself was holding its breath. The usual sounds of the city, the distant honking of cars, the chatter of passers-by, the hum of life, were absent. There was only the cold rush of wind and the sense that something was watching him. Tempest's instincts kicked in, his eyes scanning the streets, but he saw nothing. His breath came in short bursts as he moved through the alleys, alert, his quirk at the ready, prepared for any attack. But it wasn't the environment that was about to become his adversary. It was the darkness itself. Izumi stood in the shadows, her glowing yellow eyes cutting through the blackness like twin beacons of malevolent light. She had been watching him for several minutes now, moving like a specter, blending seamlessly with the night. Her tall, twisted figure crouched low, hidden by the crumbling ruins of a broken wall. Izumi was far more than just a killer. She was an entity of nightmares. And tonight, Tempest would learn that the real horror was not in the body she left behind, but in the presence she brought with her. Tempest felt it first, a sudden, unnatural chill creeping over his skin. It was like the temperature of the world had dropped, and a weight seemed to press down on him, suffocating him. His breath formed clouds in the air, his mind racing to make sense of the feeling. It's her. He had heard the rumors. He had seen the signs. The killer who left bodies in twisted, grotesque displays. The one who left a trail of death and terror, and whose name had been whispered in dark corners. Valek. His gut twisted as he realized just how close she was. And then, the air around him shifted, like the wind had stopped. No, he realized with horror. It wasn't the wind that had stopped. It was her presence, suffocating the very atmosphere. Without warning, Izumi stepped from the shadows. Her figure flickered momentarily before fully emerging, and for the briefest of moments, Tempest saw her in all her terrifying glory. Her pale, sickly skin seemed to shimmer in the low light, a sickly radiance that made his stomach churn. Her elongated fingers stretched out like claws, her wide, glowing eyes staring at him with a cold, emotionless gaze. But it wasn't just her appearance that chilled him to the bone. It was the way she moved, unnaturally fast, like a creature that didn't belong in this world. She was fluid, like smoke in the wind, yet at the same time, solid as death itself. Tempest's heart pounded in his chest. He readied himself, fingers twitching with the urge to summon his wind. But before he could act, she was already upon him. Izumi's movements were too swift, too fluid for Tempest to track. She lunged with unnatural force, her claws raking through the air toward his face. Tempest barely had time to raise his arm, his wind barriers forming just in time to deflect the strike. The force of her swipe sent a shock wave through his body, knocking him back a few feet, but he recovered quickly. "Ooh, what are you?" Tempest gasped, his quirk flaring to life. The wind around him picked up, swirling into a violent gust meant to knock her off balance, but Izumi barely flinched. She simply watched him. The night air grew heavier as Izumi approached, her movements predatory and deliberate. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was all the message he needed. She was toying with him, testing him like a cat playing with a mouse. Tempest didn't waste time hesitating. He blasted the air around him, sending a powerful shockwave toward Izumi. The gusts were enough to send debris flying and knock down nearby barrels. The wind whistled and howled, a fierce storm under his command. Yet, when the dust settled, Izumi was gone. He spun around, eyes wide. Where had she gone? Suddenly, there was movement behind him. Tempest's eyes barely had time to widen before Izumi's clawed hand shot out, grabbing his throat and slamming him against the side of a building. The air in his lungs was squeezed out in an instant. He struggled to breathe, but her grip was like iron. His wind powers flared, trying to push her away, but it was as if she fed off the pressure, her strength only growing. Izumi's face was inches from his, her glowing eyes searing through him. She tilted her head, a slow, bone-chilling grin spreading across her face, revealing sharp teeth. The silence of the moment was broken only by his gasping breaths. He tried to scream, but it was useless. His strength was draining with every second. Without warning, she threw him. Tempest crashed into the ground, his body skidding painfully across the rough pavement. His mind was clouded with dizziness, and his body screamed in agony, but instinct drove him to move. He had to get away. He staggered to his feet, his quirk summoning a massive gust of wind to carry him away from her. But before he could fully retreat, she appeared in front of him again, too fast. Izumi's clawed hand struck out again, but this time, Tempest was ready. He pushed himself into the air with a fierce gust, flipping backward to avoid her strike. The ground where he had been standing shattered as she missed, her claws sinking deep into the concrete. She growled in frustration, but quickly recovered. "Stay back," Tempest shouted, summoning the full force of his wind, aiming a devastating blast of air directly at Izumi. But Izumi wasn't afraid. She moved with terrifying precision, sidestepping the wind as if it was nothing. She closed the distance between them in seconds, grabbing him again by the arm, her strength far outmatching his own. With a sudden, bone-crushing twist, she snapped his arm. The crack echoed in his ears, and Tempest's scream of pain was swallowed by the oppressive night. The fight had gone on too long. He could feel his strength failing. Izumi's speed, her sheer power, was unlike anything he had ever encountered. With his body broken and his movements slow, Tempest realized he wasn't going to survive this. But as Izumi prepared to finish him off, a flicker of movement caught her eye. The distant sound of sirens, the approach of backup. The heroes were closing in. Izumi paused, her grip loosening just slightly. It was enough for Tempest to muster his remaining strength and break free. He stumbled back, BLD dripping from his arm, gasping for breath. "I'll get you," he hissed through gritted teeth, knowing full well he was no match for her. But his instincts told him that if he didn't leave now, there would be no tomorrow. In a flash, Izumi disappeared into the shadows, vanishing without a trace, her presence lingering like a haunting memory. Tempest stumbled to his feet, his body shaking with pain. His arm was broken, his energy depleted. He had barely escaped with his life. He knew he wouldn't get another chance. "She's no human," he whispered to himself, his heart racing. "This is something else entirely." The hunt had just begun, and for him, it was already too late. Tempest stumbled through the darkened streets, each step heavier than the last. His arm, now twisted and broken, hung uselessly at his side, BLD dripping down his torn uniform. His chest was tight with pain, and the fatigue of his body was unlike anything he'd ever felt before. He couldn't remember the last time he had been so close to death. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to keep moving, to get back to the Hero Public Safety Commission and report what had just happened. Izumi, or rather the creature that had become Valek, was far beyond anything they had encountered before. But the pain was overwhelming. His breath came in shallow gasps, his legs shaking beneath him. Tempest gritted his teeth and pressed on, staggering toward the nearest alleyway where he could regroup. The heroes would need this information. This was more than just a killer on the loose. She was something else. It felt like hours before Tempest finally reached the headquarters, though he knew it was only a matter of minutes. The adrenaline in his veins was wearing thin, and his body was screaming for relief. But the moment he pushed open the doors of the Hero Public Safety Commission, the sight of the heroes already gathered within made him straighten his back and force a calm expression. "Tempest," a voice called out, sharp and worried. Ryukyu, the one who had uncovered the name Valek through the gruesome letter-shaped body displays, rushed over to him. The others, Endeavor, Gran Torino, and a few others, followed close behind. He was met with a wave of concerned faces, but Ryukyu's expression faltered when she saw his bloodied and broken state. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tightening. Tempest shook his head. "It's worse than we thought. She's not human, Ryukyu. Whatever she is, it's something else." His voice trembled, and he winced at the pain in his arm. "I barely escaped with my life." The room fell silent as the gravity of his words sank in. Endeavor was the first to break the silence. "Describe what happened." "Everything." Tempest took a steadying breath, forcing himself to remain composed. Her appearance, it was like a twisted nightmare. Pale, almost sickly looking. Her eyes were glowing. Her presence, it felt like the air itself was suffocating. She didn't speak, didn't hesitate. She moved like something out of a horror story. She got me. She was so fast, so strong I could barely react. It was a blur of motion. I only survived because He stopped himself, biting back the memory of the bone-crushing grip that had nearly ended him. "I don't know how much longer we have. She's coming for everyone." The room was heavy with tension as the heroes processed his report. Gran Torino's eyebrows furrowed. "This is far worse than we anticipated. We've been dealing with a psychopath, but it sounds like there's something deeply unnatural about her." Endeavor's fiery gaze turned cold. "So, we're not just hunting down a killer. We're hunting down something otherworldly." His fists clenched at his sides. "We need to act fast. We can't afford to lose any more heroes or civilians." Meanwhile, Izumi was far from the safety of the commission. Her bloodlust had only intensified after her encounter with Tempest. The thrill of the hunt, the rush of power over life and death, made her hunger for more. She was unstoppable. The streets were quiet once again, but her senses were heightened. The shadows whispered to her, like old friends calling her home. She had tasted the fear of one hero, and now she longed for more. The world was her hunting ground, and she would show no mercy. Her next victim was a street vendor, a simple man trying to make a living on the outskirts of the city. His food stand late at night, unaware that death was stalking him. Izumi stood behind him, silent as death itself. The man's voice broke the silence, calling out to passers-by, but when he turned around to fetch something from his cart, he froze. His gaze met the pale, glowing eyes of the demon standing just a few feet away. He didn't scream. There was no time. Her claws shot out like lightning, slashing through the air toward his neck. He barely had time to react, the force of the attack tearing into his flesh, ripping it wide open. The vendor fell to the ground, clutching his throat, gasping for air as he bled out on the cold pavement. His body convulsed for a moment before falling limp, his lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. Izumi lingered for a moment, savoring the moment. The BLD that pooled around the man's body was intoxicating, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. She wasn't finished yet. Izumi moved deeper into the city, her senses alive with the promise of more victims. Her mind danced with the idea of the chaos she would bring, the terror she would spread. Her next target was a small group of students huddled together, chatting near a bus stop. They didn't see her coming. She was fast, a blur of darkness as she moved through the shadows, blending with the night. She appeared before them in an instant, the light from the street lamp casting an eerie glow on her ghastly form. The students froze. One of them screamed, but before they could flee, Izumi was upon them. She wasn't gentle. She wasn't merciful. Her claws sliced through them one by one, and their screams echoed through the streets, but no one was close enough to hear. The BLD flowed freely, staining the pavement and the walls. Izumi reveled in it, her twisted grin widening with each life she ended. The darkness around her seemed to deepen, as though it were welcoming her. She was a creature of the night, a specter that thrived in the shadows. Back at the Hero Public Safety Commission, Tempest had been patched up, though his arm was still in a sling. He was sitting at a table, his body aching, but his mind still racing with what he had witnessed. He couldn't shake the image of Izumi. No, Valek, her glowing eyes, the way she moved, so unnervingly fast and powerful. He knew that, whatever she was not something they could defeat through conventional means. It wasn't just about strength or speed. It was about the presence she exuded, the sheer terror she inspired. "Where do we start?" Ryukyu asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "How do we stop something like that?" "We need to find her," All Might said firmly, his expression determined. "She's toying with us. The bodies, the signs, it's all part of her game. And we'll end it." But Izumi wasn't done playing yet. She was in the streets, watching them from the shadows, waiting for the moment when they would get too close, when their false sense of hope would lull them into complacency. She was the nightmare they couldn't escape, and she would make sure they understood no one was safe. The heroes would come, and when they did, she would be ready. The fog of the city had grown thicker with each passing night. As Izumi prowled the streets, her senses sharp, she began to feel something stir within her, something darker, deeper, that had been quietly slumbering beneath the surface. Her power, the dark force that had always been part of her, had been evolving, adapting, responding to the BLD she had spilled, the terror she had instilled in those who had crossed her path. It started with a faint whisper, a cold sensation running down her spine. The first time it happened, Izumi had brushed it off, thinking it was just another fleeting moment of her mind wandering in the aftermath of a kill. But over the next few nights, the sensation grew stronger, more distinct. She felt it as she walked through the abandoned alleys, the weight of something ancient and oppressive hanging in the air. It was as though the shadows themselves had come to life, swirling and beckoning her closer. The darkness welcomed her, urging her to explore the depth of her true nature. And then it happened. One night, as she stood over the body of her latest victim, a young woman, her mind blank with the satisfaction of the kill, the shadows surrounding her began to move. They flickered and shifted, twisting unnaturally around her, and for the briefest of moments, it was as if they were alive. Izumi's eyes widened as a strange force surged through her, her body reacting without thought. The shadows seemed to pulse, filling the empty space around her with a feeling of power. She had never experienced anything like this before. Tentatively, she reached out a hand, and, as if by instinct, the shadows slithered toward her. They wrapped around her fingers like tendrils of darkness, crawling up her arm, thick and heavy, yet strangely comforting. Izumi closed her eyes, letting the feeling wash over her, savoring the sensation of power flowing through her veins. In that moment, she understood. These shadows were not just a part of her. They were her extension. She could shape them, mold them, and use them to her will. The next night, Izumi decided to experiment. She had chosen her target carefully, a middle-aged man who had been wandering the streets alone, oblivious to the danger closing in around him. He had no idea what fate awaited him, but he was about to learn. As the man walked through the dimly lit alley, Izumi stepped from the shadows, her form twisting and flickering like a shadowy apparition. He froze in terror, eyes wide, as he gazed upon her twisted figure. "You! What are you?" the man stammered, his voice trembling with fear. He could sense something inhuman in her presence. His legs quivered, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Izumi tilted her head, the sickly smile spreading across her face as she observed the man's fear. She could feel it radiating from him like a tangible force, raw and potent. Yes, fear, she thought, savoring the emotion like a feast. "Do you feel it?" she asked softly, her voice a whisper on the wind. "The fear? It's real, isn't it?" The man couldn't speak, his voice caught in his throat as his body trembled. Izumi could see it, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with terror. She could taste it in the air, like the sharp tang of copper. Izumi stepped closer, and as she did, something strange happened. The shadows around her began to pulse and swirl, feeding off the fear. The man's body stiffened as if he were paralyzed, his pupils dilating. Izumi raised her hand, palm open, and to her surprise, the shadows stretched toward him, entering his body. He gasped as the darkness seeped into his skin, twisting and curling through his veins. His body jerked violently, and his eyes rolled back into his head as the shadows began to control him. Izumi grinned. This was no longer just about fear, it was about taking control. She could possess him. For the next hour, Izumi experimented with her newfound power, using the man like a puppet. She forced his limbs to move against his will, twisting his body into unnatural contortions. His voice, now little more than a distorted whisper, cried out in terror, but it was no use. Izumi was in complete control. She had never felt more alive. But that wasn't all. As she released the man from her hold, he collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. His body was shaking, broken, but his fear remained. Izumi could still feel it, terror that hung in the air like smoke from fire. She wasn't done yet. Izumi raised her hand once more, and this time, instead of controlling him, she reached deeper, into him, through him. Her shadows entered his mind, threading through his thoughts, searching for his most primal fears, his deepest regrets. It wasn't enough to simply make him afraid. She wanted to become his fear. The man screamed as visions began to flood his mind, visions of his own death, twisted and grotesque. His family, his friends, all turned against him. Every memory of betrayal, every moment of weakness, twisted into a terrifying nightmare. He clawed at his own face as if trying to tear the images away, but they wouldn't stop. Izumi's eyes glowed with a fierce hunger as she watched him crumble. She could feel the power surging through her. This was more than just fear, it was fear incarnate. Her smile widened, but as the man's cries grew weaker, something else caught her attention. The shadows around her pulsed again, and she felt something different. A strange, almost soothing presence filled the space, like a thick, heavy fog. It was as if the darkness itself had become stronger, immortal. Izumi stared down at the man's crumpled body, her heart pounding with excitement as a strange realization hit her. She wasn't just manipulating fear. She was becoming immortal in her own way, resilient. The shadows protected her, shielded her from harm, and gave her the strength to keep going, even when she should have been tired, even when her body should have been exhausted. She was unstoppable. The next few days were spent in a haze of experimentation and discovery. Izumi learned that her shadows could not only possess others and amplify their fears, but they could also heal her. Wounds that would have otherwise crippled her seemed to vanish within seconds as the shadows enveloped her, knitting her flesh back together with an eerie, unnatural speed. She had discovered the limits of her resilience. No matter the damage she took, she could always regenerate, always heal. And she could do it again and again and again. Her thirst for power grew with each passing moment. Izumi stood in the center of a darkened alley, surrounded by the lifeless bodies of her latest victims. Her eyes glowed with an unsettling brightness, her mind humming with the possibilities of what she had just unlocked. Fear, possession, unholy resilience. She had only begun to scratch the surface of what she could truly do. The world, she realized, was not ready for her, and she didn't care. It was her world now. With a final glance at the bodies she had left behind, Izumi turned and melted into the shadows once more. The hunt was far from over. It had only just begun. The Hero Public Safety Commission was a flurry of activity. Heroes from all across the country had converged on the headquarters, working tirelessly to uncover the truth behind the string of gruesome murders that had plagued the city. The name Valek loomed over them like a dark cloud, and with each passing day, the horror of her existence grew clearer. Ryukyu stood near the central command table, a grim expression on her face as she stared at the data gathered on Izumi's recent killings. She had been tracking the patterns, trying to discern any semblance of logic to the madness. But the more she looked, the more unsettling it became. It was as if Izumi, or whatever she had become, was evolving. "We can't keep up with this," Ryukyu muttered, rubbing her temple. Every time we think we have a lead, she slips away. Gran Torino, his eyes narrowed in thought, responded. She's toying with us. This isn't just about the kills anymore. It's about testing her powers, seeing what she can do. This isn't random. She's experimenting. The heroes were right. Izumi had already begun to explore the depths of her new powers, and her experiments had taken on a twisted, almost scientific nature. The fear she was generating wasn't just about terror. It was about understanding the core of human suffering, bending it to her will. Her latest victims, an entire group of elderly citizens living in a forgotten neighborhood, had become part of her twisted research. Izumi hadn't simply killed them. She had possessed one of them, used his body to move and speak in ways that were unnatural, then discarded him when he was of no further use. She watched, fascinated, as the shadow she controlled slithered into the bodies of the elderly, manipulating them like puppets. It was late at night when Ryukyu and Tempest, alongside a few other heroes, made their way to the crime scene, a quiet residential area, eerily silent except for the flickering street lamps and the soft sound of wind rustling through the trees. They had received an anonymous tip, one that led them to the grisly discovery of the victims. Ryukyu stepped over the threshold of the small, dilapidated building, her eyes scanning the dark interior. The scent of decay was heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of BLD. There was a faint, oppressive energy that she couldn't shake, as if the very walls were watching her. "This place, it feels wrong," Tempest muttered, his voice low. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, an instinctual warning signal that something was terribly off. "Keep your guard up," Ryukyu ordered quietly, motioning for the others to fan out. They moved cautiously, stepping through the darkened halls of the abandoned building. There was an unsettling stillness, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing through the narrow corridors. It wasn't long before they found the first body, an elderly man, his eyes wide open in a silent scream. But it wasn't just his expression that was disturbing. It was the way his body had been positioned. His arms were bent at odd angles, his neck twisted unnaturally to one side, and his legs were splayed out in a grotesque imitation of a puppet. She did this?" Tempest asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryukyu's face darkened. "Yes, but that's not the worst part." They continued through the building, finding more bodies, each one arranged in a similar manner, bent, twisted, and broken, but the real horror came when they saw the pattern. The victims' bodies were arranged in a circle, each of them positioned at a precise point along the perimeter. In the center of the circle, a single object had been placed, a large blackened crucifix, its wooden frame warped and cracked, its surface scarred as if something had torn through it. The sight was chilling in its own right, but what truly struck the heroes was the position of the bodies. One of them was lying on its back, but instead of the usual signs of death, its eyes were wide open, staring directly up at the ceiling. Its pupils had been completely drained, leaving nothing but a hollow, white void. She was experimenting with possession, Gran Torino murmured, his voice grim, testing the boundaries of her abilities. The shadows, she controls them, but they can go inside the body. They alter it. Ryukyu nodded, her eyes scanning the rest of the room. "And that's not all. Look at how they're arranged." Tempest leaned in closer, noticing the faint, subtle pattern. The bodies, though contorted in painful poses, had been carefully positioned. It wasn't just random carnage. This was intentional. "She's spelling something," Tempest said, his voice growing more focused. "Look, the bodies, they form letters." Gran Torino took a closer look, his eyes narrowing as he pieced it together. "It spells out Valek." A cold, heavy silence descended upon the group as the realization hit them. Izumi, or rather the thing she had become, was not simply killing for sport. She was marking her presence, using her victims as pawns to create a twisted, unholy signature. A name, her name, spelled out on the bodies of those she had claimed. Ryukyu's face tightened with determination. "She's not just a killer. She's a monster, and we need to stop her before she does worse." Gran Torino shot her a look, his eyes grave. She's too strong, too unpredictable, and she's learning. If she can use fear to control people and manipulate their bodies, we're dealing with something far beyond the average villain. Meanwhile, Izumi was already preparing for the next phase of her experiments. Her latest kill, an unsuspecting young woman walking home late at night, had been the perfect subject for what she wanted to try next. She had followed her quietly, blending into the darkness. When the woman had paused near a darkened alleyway, Izumi had made her move, her claws extending like wicked, sharp knives, silencing the woman before she could scream. But this time, Izumi wasn't satisfied with just killing her. No, this time, she was going to possess her, just like she had with the elderly man weeks ago. Only this time, Izumi wanted to understand more about the way fear twisted the mind. She felt it, the darkness in her gut, urging her to go deeper, to make the woman feel every ounce of terror before she consumed her. She could feel the woman's thoughts, the residue of her emotions as they coursed through her body. Fear, weakness, regret. Izumi smiled, savoring the rush of power as she sank her claws into the woman's body, feeling the shadows enter her mind like a snake slithering into its prey. She owned her now. Back at the commission, the heroes were just beginning to understand the extent of Izumi's transformation. Her ability to control shadows, possess others, and manipulate fear was evolving at an exponential rate. They had no idea how long she had been experimenting or how much more she had learned, but one thing was certain. They were running out of time. Where do we even begin? Ryukyu asked, her voice tight with frustration. We'll keep tracking her movements, Gran Torino said grimly. But we need to be ready for anything. This isn't just a villain anymore. This is something other. Izumi, meanwhile, was already moving on to her next experiment, a new victim awaiting her in the dark. The heroes had only just begun to uncover the horrors she had unleashed. And Izumi, like a shadow, was always one step ahead. The shadows within the dimly lit room of the League of Villains headquarters flickered and twisted as an eerie silence filled the air. It wasn't just the quiet of an empty space. It was the kind of silence that came with the promise of something dangerous. All four members present, despite their individual backgrounds, felt the tension thick in the room. This was a moment that could change everything. Garaki, the elderly scientist who had once been a revered researcher, sat hunched over his desk, his hands steepled in front of him. His fingers trembled slightly as he read through the latest reports. In the dim light, his thin spectacles gleamed with a reflective intensity, but the look in his eyes was that of a man who had seen the consequences of tampering with powers far beyond his comprehension. "It's her," Garaki muttered under his breath, as though speaking to himself. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of someone who had unearthed something terrifying. Across from him, Shigaraki Tamura, the volatile leader of the League, leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of disdain and curiosity. His fingers twitched involuntarily, as they always did when he was near something interesting or something he could destroy. He had heard the whispers, the rumors, but now it was clear. This was more than just some twisted villain. Izumi, or whatever she had become, was no mere threat. She was something new, something that could change the course of their chaotic world. "Who the hell is she?" Shigaraki growled. His red eyes bored into Garaki, a hint of impatience seeping into his voice. "You've been mumbling about this for days now. Spit out." Garaki adjusted his glasses, his hands shaking ever so slightly as he turned a page in a dossier filled with reports on a series of unexplained murders, disappearances, and most unsettlingly, patterns of killings that hinted at unnatural powers. "Her name is Izumi Midoriya," Garaki explained, his voice steady, but his words laced with something akin to fear. "Her quirk is not like anything we've seen before. She's something different." He hesitated for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "Her power is based on shadows, living shadows, and she has the ability to possess people, control them like puppets, make them experience their deepest fears. She can twist them until they break." Shigaraki scoffed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something dark, hungry. The idea of power was always tantalizing to him. Sounds like another freak show to me. Hirojuri, the calm and composed figure who stood silently in the corner, spoke up. His voice was measured, always carefully chosen. You're wrong, Tamura. This is not just another freak show. Shigaraki shot Kirojiri a sharp glare, but Kirojiri didn't flinch. Instead, his gaze shifted to the documents Garaki had spread across the table, his dark, smoky form moving slightly closer. Izumi Midoriya isn't just a killer. She's a force, one that can manipulate fear, possession, and even the essence of life itself. What she is capable of is beyond anything we've encountered in our own ranks. Garaki nodded, his brow furrowed with worry. She's not like the others we've faced. She doesn't just hurt people. She makes them suffer, slowly, painfully. She understands fear like no one else. Shigaraki crossed his arms, annoyed by the prolonged talk, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of intrigue. So what? She's some kind of spooky ghost witch? What's that got to do with us? Before Garaki could respond, the voice of All for One, the mastermind behind the League, cut through the tension in the room, smooth and calculating. Tamura, you missed the point. This is far more than just another quirky villain. Izumi Midoriya has the potential to be a weapon, a tool to further our goals. If we can control her, HRNSS her powers, she could be a game changer. Shigaraki scowled, not liking the idea of another tool, but he stayed quiet, letting All for One continue. Her quirk is not just destructive, it's manipulative. Her ability to possess and control others can create chaos on a scale we've never seen. Imagine having an army of people who fear nothing, because their minds have been twisted into SBM sin. This is the kind of power we need to challenge the heroes, to make them fear us. The fear she instills is a weapon in and of itself. Kirojiri's voice was the next to break the silence. And her resilience, unlike anyone else. She doesn't just kill, she regenerates, becomes even stronger. She's an unholy force. For once, we face an enemy whose weaknesses aren't easily exploited. Garaki shuffled through his papers, finally coming across a set of images. He placed them on the table for the others to see, a collection of photographs showing the aftermath of Izumi's work. The bodies twisted into grotesque shapes, the arrangement of corpses forming words, and the last photograph, her first major killing spree, a trail of bodies forming a shape. A name, Valek. Shigaraki squinted at the photo, his expression unreadable. What the hell is this? Some kind of signature? Garaki nodded solemnly. That's what we're trying to figure out. She's marking her kills with her name, perhaps to claim ownership, or perhaps to send a message. All for One's lips curled into a slow smile, the implications of this new discovery playing out in his mind. A name, he murmured. Valek. A fitting name for a being like her. It will be interesting to see how she fits into our plans. The next few days saw the League of Villains move cautiously, each step calculated as they sought to understand more about Izumi Midoriya, now known in the criminal underworld as Valek. Garaki's research grew more intense, delving into the origins of her powers and how they might be replicated or manipulated. Kirojiri worked tirelessly to gather information on Izumi's movements and to track her ongoing experiments. All for One, however, had a different goal in mind. He saw potential, an opportunity. He reached out to some of his informants, hoping to find a way to make contact with her. Izumi Midoriya was a force they couldn't afford to ignore, but they also couldn't afford to let her slip through their fingers. Shigaraki was restless. He paced around the room, his hands instinctively scratching at his neck, an action that had become more frequent as of late. So what now? We wait for her to come to us. No, All for One replied, his voice dripping with quiet confidence. We'll make the first move. We'll extend an invitation, one that she can't refuse. Shigaraki stopped pacing. You want us to go after her? All for One's eyes glimmered in the low light. I want to see if she'll accept the invitation. I want to see if we can offer her something more than what she's already discovered on her own. It wasn't long before Izumi would feel the subtle tug of fate as the League of Villains began their pursuit of her. The invitation had been set, A meeting between them was inevitable. Whether she would accept or refuse, they didn't know. But they had already begun laying the groundwork for what could be the most dangerous alliance of all. And Izumi Midoriya, the dark, twisted force known as Valek, would soon be forced to decide, join the League or continue her reign of terror alone. The game was about to begin. The League of Villains had set the stage. Their plan was simple enough. Extend an invitation to Izumi Midoriya to bring the dark force known as Valek into their fold. The invitation had been sent, carefully orchestrated through various channels. They knew she would come eventually, whether for power, for control, or perhaps for the satisfaction of destruction, they didn't know. But they had prepared for this moment. The meeting was to take place in a dilapidated, abandoned church, a place of shadows and death, fitting for the presence they were about to welcome. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air damp and cold. The remnants of the stained glass windows created haunting reflections on the walls, their fractured forms flickering like ghosts. Shigaraki, Kirojuri, Garaki, and all for one stood in the center of the church, surrounded by empty pews and the smell of decay. They had prepared for this moment, each member of the League filled with a combination of anticipation and dread. There were no guards here, no one to stop her. They had been told that this meeting was inevitable, and they would not turn back. "She's coming," Garaki said, his voice weak and trembling as he peered into the darkness, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. All for One, as always, remained unfazed. His hands were steepled together, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Let her come. We're ready for whatever she brings." Shigaraki smirked, his fingers twitching as his eyes narrowed. "I'm not so sure I like the idea of waiting for her to show up. We should have gone after her first. She doesn't scare me." Kirojuri, ever the diplomat, said nothing, though his sharp eyes scanned the room, anticipating the worst. Then the air shifted. The temperature dropped. The darkness in the room deepened, as though an unnatural shadow was descending upon them. A feeling of presence so thick that it seemed to choke the very life from the air. And then she appeared. Izumi Midoriya, or rather Valek, stepped into the broken light of the church. Her figure was an unsettling silhouette against the dim glow of the remnants of stained glass windows, her long, skeletal arms curling at her sides. Her black habit-like attire fluttered like an ominous shroud, her eyes glowing with an unnatural, purple light that pierced through the darkness. A twisted, sinister grin adorned her pale face, her sharp, elongated teeth visible beneath her eerie, translucent skin. All for One's confident smile faltered for the briefest of moments. Kirojuri's face, usually unreadable, showed signs of unease. Garaki's breath hitched as he instinctively took a step back, while Shigaraki, usually unbothered by anything, felt the weight of the silence crush him. His fingers itched, but not from excitement. It was the kind of fear that crawled under your skin, the kind that made your heart race and your breath come short. Valek, all for one, spoke calmly, despite the weight of her presence pressing against him. "I see you've arrived. Welcome. We've been expecting you." Izumi tilted her head, her grin widening, her eyes narrowing to slits as she examined them with an eerie curiosity. The world seemed to bend and distort around her as she stepped closer. "Expecting me?" Her voice was soft, almost mocking, but filled with an echoing menace that seemed to seep into the walls of the church. "How foolish. I did not come here for your invitation. I came to see what kind of weak creatures would dare to summon me." Shigaraki clenched his fists, frustration growing. "We're not weak, you little freak. We wanted to see if you'd be useful to us." Izumi's gaze flickered over to Shigaraki, and for a moment, her smile twisted into something far darker. "Useful," she repeated, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm not some tool for you to control. I am the end of all things." The room seemed to grow colder still, as her words cut through the air like a cold wind. Izumi moved with unsettling grace, her elongated limbs bending at unnatural angles, her body swaying like a shadow as she stepped closer to the League. Garaki could barely breathe. His hands trembled, his mind reeling from the realization that they were completely out of their depth. This was a mistake, he murmured under his breath, but it was too late to retreat now. Izumi slowly, almost lazily, raised her hand. The shadows around her seemed to respond, twisting, curling, and rising like dark smoke. They formed shapes, ghastly figures, that hovered at her side, their eerie presence only amplifying her power. "No mercy," Izumi whispered, her voice a haunting rasp. Suddenly, with a screeching noise that sounded like the tearing of reality itself, she lunged forward. Shigaraki barely had time to react. He swung his hand forward, fingers crackling with destruction, but the air thickened with the weight of her malevolent presence. Before he could even blink, her claws, sharp as razors, slashed through the air, cutting through his left side. His body spasmed in pain as he staggered backward, a scream catching in his throat. The wound was deep, raw, and burning with an unnatural sensation that sent waves of panic through his chest. His hand reached for his throat, as though choking on air, but he couldn't breathe. Izumi was on him in an instant. Her black eyes gleamed with wicked delight, and she leaned in close, her chilling breath sending an icy shiver down his spine. "Your fear is so delicious," she whispered, before twisting her hand into his throat, tightening around his windpipe, crushing the life out of him with ease. All for One moved quickly, stepping forward with a harsh, commanding tone. "Enough. But his voice was cut short as Izumi's shadow stretched and distorted, forming a massive, twisted face that loomed over him, a wide, toothy grin splitting the darkness. Izumi didn't let him finish his sentence. She stepped forward, effortlessly, her skeletal arms reaching for him as her shadow morphed, her tendrils of darkness wrapping around his form like chains. "I don't need your words." Her voice was a low, guttural growl that shook his bones. Kirojiri attempted to intervene, using his warp gate to transport her away. But Izumi's shadow tore through the air, blocking the warp portal with a force that caused the very fabric of space to tremble. "You can't escape me," Izumi whispered. She raised her hand toward Kirojiri, her fingers curled in a menacing fashion. "You're just another piece of prey." Before Kirojiri could react, her clawed hand shot forward, stabbing through his chest. He let out a strangled gasp, his body convulsing as he tried to summon a gate, but it was too late. Izumi's power surged into him, sending a dark, consuming force into his body. His form twisted and flickered, and for a brief moment, his body went rigid before it collapsed to the ground in a heap. Only Garaki remained standing, barely able to breathe. His body shook as he stared at the disaster in front of him, completely paralyzed by fear. Izumi slowly approached him, her twisted grin widening with sadistic glee. "No mercy," she repeated, her voice almost a chant, as her shadow snaked around his legs, dragging him toward her. Moments later, the church was quiet again. The League of Villains had been completely obliterated. Their bodies were sprawled across the cold stone floor, twisted in unnatural positions, with expressions of fear frozen on their faces. The entire space was thick with the remnants of their fear and suffering. Izumi stood alone, her eyes glowing with satisfaction. She surveyed the destruction for a moment before turning away, her skeletal form vanishing into the shadows. The League had fallen. Valek had delivered her message. And now, the world would tremble before her. The abandoned church reeked of death. The once sacred halls, bathed in dim morning light filtering through shattered stained glass, had become a grotesque tableau of horror. The stone walls seemed to weep with condensation, the air thick with the stench of BLD and decay. Endeavor, Detective Naomasa Tsukachi, and a squad of pro-heroes entered the ruined structure, their boots echoing against the cold, desecrated floor. They had tracked the League of Villains to this location weeks ago, expecting to find a hideout, perhaps an operation in progress. What they found instead was something far worse. A massacre. The first body they identified was Kirojiri. His usually well-kept suit was soaked in blackened BLD, his mist-like quirk frozen in mid-expulsion, as though it had been forcibly sealed in his body. His lifeless eyes were frozen open, his mouth contorted in a silent scream. It was as if he had been in the process of teleporting before something ripped him apart from the inside out. Not far from him lay Dr. Garaki, his frail form crumpled against a rotting pew. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, his face barely recognizable due to the sheer force of whatever had caved in his skull. A deep claw mark trailed across his chest, as though something had toyed with him before finally ending his miserable existence. Then there was Shigaraki. Naomasa stopped cold when he saw him. The former heir of all for one was suspended in mid-air, his body nailed to the crumbling altar by long, rusted iron spikes driven through his wrists and ankles, mimicking some mockery of a crucifixion. His face, once so full of rage and ambition, was now twisted into a frozen mask of terror. His throat had been ripped open, but not with a blade. No, this was something else. Something with claws. Endeavor clenched his fists, flames briefly flickering to life around his hands. What the hell did this? It wasn't one of our own, Naomasa muttered. No hero would kill like this. One by one, they identified the remains of the League. All for one, the seemingly untouchable demon of Japan, was nowhere to be found. But the sheer brutality of what had happened to the others left no doubt. This was no simple villain skirmish. This was a slaughter. And then they saw the message. Carved into the wall behind the defiled altar, written in deep, blackened BLD, were 4 words in Latin. Marcio serpentium et umbrarum. One of the pro-heroes immediately pulled out their phone, running the phrase through a translator. A few tense moments later, the screen displayed the English translation. The Marquis of Serpents and Shadows. A cold silence filled the air. What the hell does that mean? One of the heroes whispered. Naomasa exhaled sharply. It's a title, a declaration. Whoever did this wants us to know their name or their rank. Endeavor stepped forward, eyes burning as he scanned the destruction. His voice was a low, seething growl. Then we hunt them down. Whatever, whoever, this Marquis is, we end them before they do this again. Before anyone could respond, another discovery was made. One of the investigators was painstakingly arranging the crime scene photos, trying to make sense of the positions of the bodies. At first, it seemed like nothing more than random placement, until they laid them all together. The BLD, the bodies, the arrangement. It spelled something. A single word. Valak. Every drop of warmth left the room. No, Naomasa whispered, his skin crawling with something that felt primal. He wasn't religious, but this felt unholy. The heroes exchanged uneasy glances. None of them spoke the name out loud, as if saying it would give it power. Then, for the first time, they truly understood. This wasn't a villain. This wasn't a human. This was something far, far worse. And it had only just begun. The tension in the HPSC building was palpable. The normally vibrant air of heroism was now thick with unease. Every hallway seemed too quiet. Every room too still. The top 10 heroes sat in their seats, their faces a mix of determination and barely concealed dread. The HPSC president, a man known for his commanding presence, paced back and forth at the front of the conference room, his brow furrowed in deep thought. And next to him, perched on his seat with a quiet intensity, was Principal Nizu. The head of UA, though his appearance remained calm and collected, could not hide the dark thoughts swirling beneath the surface. He had seen much in his time: quirk evolution, dark experimentation, the rise of some of the worst villains Japan had ever known, but what he'd seen recently was beyond comprehension. Nizu adjusted his glasses and turned to the assembly, the weight of the moment settling in. "We've all seen the aftermath of what occurred at the church," he began, his voice steady despite the grim circumstances. "But there are still so many unanswered questions. Who, or what, could carry out something so calculated and brutal?" The room was silent for a long moment, each hero processing the implications in their own way. Finally, Endeavor spoke, his voice hard as steel. "We need to know what we're dealing with. Fast." If this thing is a villain or something else, we can't afford to sit idly by. Nizu nodded, but his eyes were narrowed, his mind churning. I've been working through the reports, talking to experts, analyzing what little we have, he said, before his gaze flicked toward the others. There's one thing that stands out to me, though. This isn't an ordinary villain. Whatever did this, it's not human in the traditional sense. I've been thinking the same, said Hawks, leaning forward. This, Valek, has the methods of a seasoned predator, but it's more than just brute force. It's out precision. It toys with its victims, like it's savoring each moment. That's what disturbs me most, Best Jeanist added, a frown pulling at his lips. It's not like typical villains. It's methodical, purposeful, like this is part of something larger. Nizu's ears perked up, and his eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Indeed, but it's not just the method that concerns me. There's something more. He looked around at the top heroes, his mind processing the limited information they had. We need to understand what kind of quirk Valek might possess. What quirk could inspire such fear, such darkness? He paused for a moment, letting the silence settle. He could feel the tension rising in a room as all eyes turned to him. The analysis, the search for answers, it was their only option now. Let me explain what I have found, Nizu continued, his voice softer now, but with a certain gravity. I've reviewed some of the footage recovered from the aftermath of the church. We've obtained something unexpected, a video. The room grew even quieter, the heroes leaning in. Nizu hit a button on the remote in his paws, and a large screen flickered to life in front of him. The footage, at first grainy and shaky, soon stabilized. The image of the League of Villains' ruined bodies filled the screen. These are the last moments of each member, Nizu explained, his voice carefully controlled. What you're about to see is the slaughter of the League of Villains, carried out by the entity now known as Valek. The first clip began, showing the cold, lifeless form of Kirojiri, his body suspended in the air by invisible forces. His mist-like quirk seemed frozen, the dark distortion of his form flickering at the edges as though fighting to escape. But something was holding him in place. Then, a figure loomed from the shadows. Valek's face appeared, an unearthly mask of pale skin, glowing eyes, and an unnatural grin. The figure moved closer, its skeletal limbs contorting with terrifying fluidity. A single elongated hand shot out, impaling Kirojiri through the chest, forcing him to remain silent, his mist frozen in place, as if suffocating him from the inside. Nizu paused the video for a moment. The manner of Kirojiri's death is significant. His quirk was locked down, sealed. This is not a fight. It's a domination of power. Whoever or whatever did this suppressed Kirojiri's abilities. The screen flickered to the next clip. Garaki was shown hunched over, his body trembling with fear. His hands desperately grasped at the broken altar around him, as though searching for an escape. His expression was wild, as though the very act of looking at Valek caused him to lose his sanity. Then, the footage zoomed in on his face as Valek's clawed hands tore through his chest. Garaki's eyes bulged in agony before his body crumpled, the camera catching the sickening sound of his ribs cracking. Nizu sighed softly. As we can see, Garaki never stood a chance. There was no struggle. Valek tore him apart with ruthless efficiency. The next clip was Shigaraki. His body was bound by chains of BLD, like thick, dark vines wrapping around his wrists and ankles. He thrashed in vain, trying to escape, but the chains only tightened. Valek stood in front of him, her twisted figure leaning in close, whispering something inaudible to the camera. Her shadow stretched impossibly long, and her fingers pierced Shigaraki's skin, cutting through his body as though he were made of paper. His screams were cut short, his life snuffed out as Valek's power overwhelmed him. Nizu's voice was heavy with the weight of what they were witnessing. Shigaraki, he is no mere villain, yet even he was powerless against whatever Valek is. We're not just dealing with a quirk. We're dealing with something unnatural. Finally, the video showed the crumpled body of All for One. His final moments were shown with eerie calm, his eyes wide in shock as he was surrounded by darkness, the shadows twisting around him. His body collapsed in on itself under an invisible weight, his limbs snapping, his throat crushed by unseen forces. Nizu hit pause, and the room was silent. As you can see, this entity, wasn't just using a quirk. It was controlling and manipulating the environment, pulling at the very fabric of the world around it. I can only hypothesize that Valek's quirk is something far beyond normal human understanding. Endeavor's flames flickered dangerously. What were we dealing with then? A quirk user? A monster? Something else entirely? Nizu stared at the screen for a long moment, contemplating the footage in silence. We don't know yet, but what I do know is that we are not facing an ordinary villain. Valek is something otherworldly, a being that operates on fear, manipulation, and overwhelming force. His voice darkened. Whatever this is, it is far more dangerous than anything we've ever faced. The heroes looked at each other, their faces grim. Endeavor's voice cut through the tension. Then we hunted down. Whatever it is. Nizu nodded gravely. Yes, we must find her before the world becomes a place of fear. We cannot let it spread. And so, with their new understanding, the heroes set their plans in motion. But as they began to organize their forces, one thing was clear. Valek was not just a villain. She was a force of nature, a creature beyond comprehension. And if they did not act fast, the world itself would belong to her. The darkness fell like a shadow over Japan, but it was more than the fall of night. It was a creeping terror that no one could escape. As the heroes scrambled to contain the growing threat that was Izumi, the true scale of her wrath began to unfold. Izumi was no longer a mere threat. She was a force. The cities began to feel the shift in the air, the sense of dread that came from her very presence. In the dead of night, a secluded Christian church lay nestled between two dense forests. Its tall, stone spires pierced the night sky, standing as a silent sentinel in a world that had long since forgotten the sanctity of its halls. The bells rang softly in the wind, a single, mournful sound that echoed across the barren landscape. The priest, an elderly man with a solemn face, had just finished his evening prayers when the doors to the church burst open with a violent crash. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and leaving a suffocating chill in the air. Before the priest could react, he felt a cold presence, a presence that filled the very space with an unholy weight. And then she appeared, Izumi. Her form was no longer the fragile, innocent child that had once graced the orphanage. She had become something far more sinister, a towering specter of death. Her skeletal limbs moved with horrifying fluidity, her eyes glowing with an unearthly light that pierced the priest's soul. The very air seemed to distort around her, as if the world itself recoiled in fear of her existence. Without a word, she advanced. The priest tried to flee, his heart pounding in his chest, but his body was frozen. Izumi's presence paralyzed him, making him weak, helpless. Her voice, cold and malicious, whispered in his mind, "You cannot escape. You will serve as a reminder." Before he could react, a claw-like hand shot out, wrapping around his neck. With a sickening crunch, his head was twisted to the side, snapping like a twig. His body fell limp, crumpling to the ground in a heap. Izumi did not pause. Her shadow stretched unnaturally long, as if it were alive, moving to surround the priest's body. In a moment of sickening reverence, she reached out, touching his mutilated form with her fingers. Her fingers curled into claws, impaling his chest, before she slowly lifted him into the air, as if preparing him for a grotesque sacrifice. The ritual began. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. Several more Christian churches across Japan fell victim to her wrath. Each church, isolated and peaceful by day, was reduced to a ruinous monument to her fury by night. The heroes could do little to prevent the massacre, as each location was found far too late, the damage already done. At St. Michael's Church, a cathedral bathed in the glow of stained glass windows, the scene was just as gruesome. Nuns, priests, and the few remaining parishioners were found crucified upon the altar. But this wasn't the simple crucifixion one might expect from a heinous act. It was twisted, grotesque. The bodies had been mutilated, their hands and feet nailed to the cross at unnatural angles. Their faces were frozen in an expression of pure terror, mouths gaping open in silent screams. The walls around them were splattered with BLD, creating a grisly painting of agony. Some of the crosses were stained with strange black fluid, as if the very essence of the victim's life force had been drained away. On the altar, a single symbol was carved into the stone, a symbol none of the heroes could immediately decipher. But the BLD beneath it had soaked through to reveal a Latin inscription, the same phrase that had appeared in the church where the League of Villains had been slaughtered. Marcio serpentium et umbrarum. The heroes exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale as they tried to process the meaning. "I've seen this before," Gran Torino muttered, staring at the ancient language. "It means the Marquis of Serpents and Shadows." It was at Our Lady of Sorrows Church that they found the worst scene yet. As the heroes arrived, the stench of death hit them immediately. The doors to the church were wide open, as though inviting them in. Inside, the pews were overturned, and the floors were covered in dark, congealed BLD. At the center of the church, the bodies of nuns and priests were arranged in a circle. Their limbs were twisted in ways that defied nature, some torn off entirely, others eviscerated beyond recognition. Their faces bore the same look of horror and despair, frozen in death. But what truly set this scene apart was the crucifix at the center of the room. The wooden figure of Christ had been distorted, the body twisted grotesquely, with teeth marks and claw marks running deep across the surface. Black veins had spread across the crucifix, as though some dark entity had seeped into it, claiming it as its own. It was there that they found the remains of the last nun, her eyes wide open, her body nailed to the crucifix in a position that seemed to defy both logic and anatomy. The crucifix itself was tainted, an unholy symbol that would forever be linked to the name Valek. At the base of the cross, a large silver knife was embedded in the floor, the handle twisted in a way that no human could have done. It was as though the weapon had been driven into the earth by an unseen force, leaving an aura of death and fear in its wake. Each discovery only brought more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Izumi's presence was no longer just a mysterious threat. It was something beyond human comprehension. The heroes found themselves unable to predict her next move. The church's symbols of life and hope were her first targets. Why? At the HPSC, a meeting of the top heroes had gathered, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Nizu stood at the front of the room, his mind working furiously. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deliberate about the churches being attacked. "We've seen the pattern now," Nizu said, his voice steady but tense. "Valek is not just targeting any random building. She's systematically going after Christian churches. Why? What is her connection to them?" Endeavor slammed his fist into his hand, frustration evident in his expression. "She's not targeting heroes or villains. It's something else. These people, these innocents, don't deserve this. We need answers," Nizu continued, tapping his claws against the table. "And I think we're getting closer to understanding her motivations. Valek's quirk? It's linked to fear. But fear of what? What does she need from these places of worship?" Before anyone could respond, Nizu clicked a button on the large screen behind him, displaying images from the latest church attack. The video footage that had been obtained was chilling, showing Izumi's grisly work in real time. On the screen, the figures of the nuns and priests twisted in unnatural ways as Izumi's shadow loomed larger and darker behind them. In the footage, she moved like a phantom, her body barely visible but for the glow of her eyes, before she lunged at her prey with the speed of a predator. One by one, they were killed, crucified, their bodies desecrated in ways no one should ever see. The BLD, the distorted crosses, and the tainted altar painted a gruesome picture that was burned into the minds of all who witnessed it. Why the churches? Nizu whispered to himself, but no answer came. Meanwhile, Izumi stood atop a hill, gazing down at the burning ruins of the latest church she had obliterated. The air was thick with the stench of death, and in the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to wail, signaling the approach of the heroes. But Izumi didn't care. She was untouchable, a vessel of fear and darkness, and nothing could stand in her way. With a single glance, she turned, disappearing into the night, her shadow stretching long across the earth, leaving a path of devastation in her wake. The heroes had seen enough, but it wasn't enough to stop her. The questions lingered. The truth about why Valek had come for the churches remained a mystery. All they knew was that Izumi was a threat like no other, and the world would never be the same again. The air was thick with unease. The heroes sat around the massive meeting table, each of them silently contemplating the aftermath of Izumi's reign of terror. She had destroyed every last Christian church in Japan, leaving behind nothing but ashes and blood-stained remnants. Her presence, once a fleeting shadow, had now become a blight upon the land, spreading fear with each passing day. In the dimly lit conference room of the HPSC, the tension was palpable. The top 10 heroes had gathered once more, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Nizu stood at the front, his small figure almost dwarfed screen behind him. He hadn't been this concerned in years, not about any one threat at least. But Izumi, or as the world had come to know her, Valek, was a puzzle that had yet to be solved. The once appealing churches that dotted Japan had all been reduced to smoldering ruins. Their remains now grim monuments to her unstoppable wrath. The bodies left behind, crucified in grotesque ways, were a testament to the evil she carried within her. And yet, one thing continued to haunt Nizu. Why the churches? The last one is gone. Endeavor muttered, his voice harsh. What now? What's her endgame? Nizu's ears twitched slightly at the question, though his eyes remained fixed on the screen in front of him. A few seconds passed, and he clicked a button, bringing up a high-resolution image that froze the room into silence. It was a clear, unblurred photograph of Izumi's face, taken moments before she had obliterated the last church in Japan. The picture was chilling, revealing the full extent of her monstrous transformation. There was no mistaking it. Her appearance was identical to Valek, the demon from the movie The Nun, and this, Nizu realized, was no coincidence. The same skeletal face, the twisted smile that twisted around her lips like a sick parody of joy, and the glowing eyes, those unholy eyes that seemed to pierce through to the soul. It was her, unmistakably. The room went eerily quiet as the image remained on the screen. Nizu took a deep breath and turned to face the gathered heroes. I believe we are missing something crucial about Izumi's quirk. We've seen the carnage, we've seen the destruction, but I believe we have yet to understand what drives her, what motivates her to carry out these attacks. There must be a reason she targets Christian churches, and I think I may have found the key. There was an immediate stir in the room, and All Might, still recovering from his last battle, leaned forward with renewed interest. Go on, Nizu, he said quietly. We're listening. Nizu's gaze grew thoughtful as he paced back and forth. Think about it. Valek, or Izumi, as we know her, has destroyed every Christian church in Japan. But the key lies in the method, the ritualistic nature of her attacks. It's more than just senseless violence. It's deliberate. She's targeting places of worship specifically, and there must be a reason. Hawks, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. Are you saying she has some sort of vendetta against churches? Nizu nodded slowly. Not a vendetta, exactly. Think about her powers, the ability to instill fear, the sheer darkness that she embodies. She is terror incarnate. But something tells me she's not entirely invulnerable. She must have a weakness, something that ties her to these churches. And if we're talking about weaknesses, Nizu continued, his voice lowering, it's important to consider the role holy symbols play in the narrative of Valek's destruction. In every church she's attacked, the victims have been sacrificed, but the churches themselves bear a certain significance. We know that she destroyed the churches with extreme prejudice, but could it be that she's drawn to them for a specific reason? So, You think there's something about the churches that could stop her? Asked Best Jeanist, a flicker of hope in his voice. Nizu's ears perked up. Exactly. It's not just the act of destruction, it's the context. If we analyze it deeper, we can hypothesize that Izumi's quirk is tied to an ancient, almost religious source of fear, a fear that is countered by holy symbols. Silver, true holy water, things we've seen her react to in strange ways. He paused, allowing the room to process his words. In every attack, she left the scene with an almost ritualistic grace, placing her victims in terrifying poses, as if trying to create some unholy masterpiece. Why does she do this? Because she is marking something. She's connected to something far older, a belief system that goes beyond mere violence. Nizu tapped a button on the console, and the image of Izumi's face was replaced by another haunting image, one of the sacrificed nuns from the church. The image was taken just moments before Izumi had crucified the body in an unsettlingly symmetrical and deliberate manner. The victim's body was left in a perfect cross shape, nails driven through the hands and feet, eyes wide open in terror. This isn't just about destruction, Nizu muttered. This is a message from her. She is marking these churches like some twisted symbol of ownership. She's marking her territory, but also confronting the fear these symbols represent. Nizu paused once again, letting the room absorb his words. If we follow this theory, he continued, it means that Izumi's quirk is not only a manifestation of fear, but is also opposed by certain forces of holiness. Silver, holy water, sacred ground. These may be the only means by which we can counter her power. A murmur of realization spread through the room. Then we need to start gathering holy symbols, Endeavor said, his eyes narrowing. We can't afford to wait any longer. If she's destroyed the last church, then what's next? How we stop her? Nizu turned to the large screen again, showing another image, one taken just hours ago. This one was from a secret video feed the HPSC had obtained during a recent church attack. It was Izumi, or rather, Valek, in full form, her face twisted into that disturbing, familiar mask of terror. Her movements were like that of a predator stalking her prey. We don't know her full potential yet, Nizu said grimly. But if she is truly drawn to places of worship, then we must explore every avenue to find her weakness. The heroes sat in silence, the weight of Nizu's theory pressing down on them. Izumi's power was something beyond understanding, something primal, but now they had a lead. The churches were the key, and it was time to find out why they were so important. At that moment, Gran Torino spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. We need to start organizing a team. We know where she's been, but we don't know where she'll go next. We need to be ready. Nizu nodded, his thoughts racing. I agree. But this time, we need more than just brute force. We need knowledge. We need holy symbols, and we need to learn everything we can about her. Valek, Izumi, maybe more than we can handle, but if we have any chance, it lies in understanding the nature of her quirk. As the meeting continued, the heroes rallied around Nizu's theory. They now had a potential answer, an idea of how to stop her. Izumi, the fear incarnate, was drawn to the churches, and her power may be rooted in the very symbols she had desecrated. But they all knew one thing for sure. The battle for Japan's soul was just beginning. The carnage continued. Izumi, Valek, as she had become known to the world, had no intention of stopping. No longer hiding in the shadows, she had begun to stalk the streets of Japan with an almost feral presence, her bloodlust driving her ever forward. She no longer restricted herself to the darkness of night, nor did she shy away from populated areas. The fear she radiated had become a deadly weapon in its own right, rendering entire blocks paralyzed with terror before she even entered. Her appearance, a nightmarish reflection of Valek, with her skeletal, twisted face and glowing eyes, had become a beacon of death. She no longer cared to sneak around. She destroyed with brazen precision. Her victims left a message she had no need to speak. No one was safe. No one was prepared for what was coming next. At the HPSC headquarters, the situation was becoming critical. The top 10 heroes were scrambling to control the chaos. Each new report was a grim reminder of Izumi's brutality. Her attacks were becoming increasingly unpredictable, no longer just confined to the cities, but now spreading into rural towns as well. Villages that had never seen the light of her terror were now her playgrounds. In one particularly gruesome incident, Izumi had wandered into a school, her hands drenched in BLD by the time she left. The students had been terrified, but it wasn't the screams of the children that kept her attention. It was their fear. She fed off it, reveled in it, until their eyes had glazed over with terror. And then she killed. Izumi's quirk, fear incarnate, had evolved into something far worse than anyone could have predicted. She could now manipulate fear so powerfully that it paralyzed her victims, left them too scared to move or scream. It was as if she had become fear itself, an immovable force that no one could outrun. Back at HPSC, Nizu had been furiously researching, trying to piece together what they knew about Izumi's quirk and her unstoppable rampage. He had already gathered all the possible holy symbols, silver, blessed artifacts, and holy water, but it was clear they wouldn't be enough. If her quirk had indeed evolved into something tied to her very essence, then there was no simple cure. They needed something more. They needed answers, and the only place that could offer them was the Vatican. "I don't care how long it takes," Nizu said, his tone sharp as he leaned over the communication table. "Get in contact with them. We need their insight on Valek, on the nature of this curse, and anything they might know about her. The Vatican has knowledge we simply don't have access to. We can't keep relying on speculation." The HPSC president was already on the phone with an emergency contact of the Vatican, a direct line set up specifically for cases like this. The fear of the situation had spread worldwide, and the Vatican had been made aware of the demonic presence wreaking havoc across Japan. While the heroes fought to keep Japan's cities under some semblance of control, the Vatican had begun its own investigation into the mysterious figure that was terrorizing the world. There was little doubt left in their minds. This was no ordinary villain. Izumi, Valek, was a being of ancient evil, and the Catholic Church had a long history with entities like her. As Izumi's killing spree continued, she showed no signs of slowing down. The media had been reporting new massacres every day. In one particularly disturbing incident, a family of 4 had been found mutilated in their home, arranged in the shape of a cross, their bodies twisted into grotesque positions. A single message was scrawled across the wall in BLD: "The light cannot save you." Izumi's thirst for terror was insatiable, and her cruelty had no bounds. The world was beginning to see her as something more than a mere villain. She was an entity of darkness, unstoppable and merciless. At the HPSC, Nizu's thoughts were a whirlwind. The clock was ticking, and Izumi's rampage was spreading faster than they could respond. Every lead they followed seemed to come up short, but they had a new hope, an answer that might give them a fighting chance: the Vatican. Later that evening, the HPSC president returned from a phone call with the Vatican's office, his face grim. He addressed the group gathered around the conference table. "They're concerned," the president said quietly. "It seems that they have encountered entities like Izumi, but they've never seen one quite like her. According to their research, she may be connected to an ancient curse, one linked to the 7 deadly sins. Specifically, she could be a manifestation of pride or wrath, 2 of the most dangerous forces in the demonology the Vatican has documented." Nizu furrowed his brow, his ears flicking. "What's that supposed to mean? And how we stop it?" The president grimaced. "The Vatican is sending over a team of experts, but they've made it clear that this situation will require more than just conventional means. We'll need to utilize sacred rituals, possibly even exorcisms, if we're to face her properly. So we're going to need more than just silver and holy water," said Endeavor, shaking his head. "Isn't that obvious?" Nizu nodded. "It seems we're dealing with something far older than we anticipated. This is no longer just a fight against Izumi. It's a battle for the very soul of Japan." As the heroes began to prepare for the coming fight, Izumi's presence continued to grow. She had no intention of stopping, and her attacks were only getting more frequent. The destruction she left in her wake was staggering. The only thing the heroes could do now was prepare for the inevitable confrontation with the terror that had no equal, and pray that the Vatican's help could be the key to stopping her before it was too late. As Izumi moved through Japan, her eyes glowing with malice, she could feel the weight of the world pressing against her. She was no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be anything but the nightmare she had become. And as she killed, she smiled. The heroes were coming, but they were no match for her. Not yet. HPSC headquarters, emergency meeting room. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. The top heroes of Japan, along with Principal Nizu and the heads of the HPSC, sat in grim silence, their faces pale as they stared at the latest reports. The air was thick with exhaustion and dread, the weight of what had transpired pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. The numbers were unfathomable. Nearly a quarter of Japan's population was dead. Entire cities had been turned into mass graves. The streets of Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, and Nagoya ran red with BLD, their once bustling districts now eerie ghost towns. Reports described mass crucifixions, bodies suspended from the sides of buildings, and entire families erased overnight. Some victims have been found entombed within the walls of their own homes, their flesh withered and drained of color, their faces frozen in expressions of indescribable terror. One by one, the emergency response teams who entered the affected areas reported the same thing: a presence, a feeling of something watching, something waiting. They refused to go in alone anymore. Even the heroes were afraid. Even All Might, the symbol of peace, was shaken. He clenched his fists, his entire body rigid with barely contained rage. How to get this far? His voice was hoarse, filled with frustration and grief. We should have stopped her before it reached this level. No one spoke. No one could. Nizu, sitting at the head of the table, was the first to break the silence. His voice was measured, but there was a rare edge of uncertainty in it. I believe we all underestimated the nature of our opponent. Valek is not just another villain. His dark eyes scanned the room. She is something that should not exist. The room remained still. No one dared to argue. Nizu took a breath before continuing. Based on our collected data, her abilities have surpassed what we previously thought possible. She has already proven herself to be more than just a quirk user. She is, in essence, an entity, a force of destruction. Exhaled sharply. So what the hell are we supposed to do? You want us to fight a goddamn demon? Nizu nodded. Yes. Analyzing the disaster. The holographic map of Japan in front of them flickered as Nizu pulled up a timeline of Valek's movements. The red zones of destruction had spread alarmingly fast, too fast. It's not random, Nizu murmured, zooming in on specific locations. She's not just killing for the sake of killing. She's hunting something. Or testing something. Hawks leaned forward, his usual carefree demeanor absent. Testing what? Nizu's expression darkened. Us. The Vatican's message. The HPSC president finally cleared his throat. The Vatican has responded to our request. They're taking this threat seriously and have already dispatched their top exorcists and demonologists. They're calling her an incarnation of the abyss. Wonderful, Mirko scoffed. They gave her a fancy title. How does that help us? They also gave us insight into her potential weaknesses, Nizu interrupted. Their records suggest that entities like Valek, or Izumi Midoriya, as she was once known, can be harmed by certain holy artifacts. We've already confirmed silver and true holy water work, but that won't be enough. Then what will be enough? Edshot asked quietly. Nizu brought up another image. This time, it was a stone tablet, ancient, covered in Latin inscriptions. The Vatican believes we need to contain her rather than kill her, Nizu explained. They've uncovered old texts detailing a similar case that took place centuries ago. If they're correct, we need to perform a ritual, one that binds her in a place where she can no longer escape. There was a pause. Best Genist crossed his arms. So we have to trap her? That's our only option. Nisa nodded. We don't have the firepower to kill her outright. Our best bet is to find a way to seal her away permanently. The heroes exchanged wary glances. This wasn't a battle where they could simply punch their way to victory. They were dealing with something far worse than any villain they had ever faced. And Izumi was still out there, slaughtering without restraint. The coming war. I'll assemble a team to retrieve the artifacts we need from the Vatican. Hawks offered, his tone unusually serious. If those priests have anything that can actually work against her, we need to get our hands on it now. Nisa nodded. I'll work on the containment plan. We need to find a location strong enough to hold her. We can't afford to make any mistakes. All Might, still looking at the holographic destruction map, clenched his jaw. And if we fail? Nizu's gaze was cold. If we fail, Japan will cease to exist. Silence filled the room. Meanwhile, as the heroes scrambled to prepare their last stand, Izumi wandered through the ruins of a church, the flames still burning in the background. Her black habit fluttered in the wind, her pale, monstrous face illuminated by the glow of embers. She could hear their desperation. She could feel their fear. And she smiled. This was only the beginning. Japan falls into darkness. The reports were becoming harder to process. It wasn't just the sheer number of the dead. It was the manner in which they died. Bodies hung from skyscrapers, their limbs contorted in unnatural angles, faces frozen in a state of horror. Rivers and reservoirs overflowed with BLD, staining the once pristine waters a deep, unnatural crimson. Entire districts were wiped out overnight. No survivors, just a lingering, oppressive presence that clung to the air like a disease. Hospitals were filled with shell-shocked survivors, their eyes wide and empty, their minds broken beyond repair. Some muttered in Latin, words they shouldn't have known. Others would only scream when the lights flickered. Many would never recover. A third of Japan was dead. And Izumi Midoriya, Valek, was still killing. HBSC War Room, the grim reality. Nizu stood before the exhausted remnants of Japan's heroic leadership, the weight of the world pressing on his small frame. The holographic map of Japan now resembled a rotting corpse, blackened and decayed, with massive sections completely eradicated. She's not slowing down, Nizu stated, his voice grim. We estimate that in another 2 months, there will be no Japan left. A heavy silence followed. All Might looked down at his clenched fists, his once unshakable resolve cracking. How do we let it get this far? They never had a chance, Hawks muttered, looking at the casualty list. None of them. Not the civilians, not the pro-heroes, not even the villains. She's unmatched. Endeavor exhaled sharply, his usual fire dampened. We need results. Did the Vatican's agents find anything? Nisa nodded, bringing up a live feed from a covert team stationed in Vatican City. Vatican City, searching for salvation. The screen flickered, revealing Hawks and a team of high-ranking HPSC operatives standing before a massive, ancient stone vault deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Nizu, Hawks said through the communicator, his tone urgent, we're inside. Behind him, several priests and exorcists chanted in Latin, their voices echoing off the old, candle-lit stone walls. One priest, Father Alonso, adjusted his silver crucifix and turned to the camera. You were right to come to us, he said, voice heavy with reverence. This is not the first time something like Valek has walked this earth. A hush fell over the room. Nizu's ears twitched. Explain. Father Alonso gestured to a series of ancient texts spread across a granite altar, each page filled with illustrations of an entity that bore an uncanny resemblance to Izumi's demonic form. This being, Valek, has existed for centuries. It is an entity of pure malice, taking hosts throughout history, leaving only devastation in its wake. The priest swallowed. Every civilization it has touched has perished. The heroes back in Japan exchanged uneasy glances. Then how has it stopped before? Nizu pressed. Father Alonso hesitated. It wasn't. A cold silence filled the meeting room. The only recorded instance of Valek being contained was in the early 1400s, the priest continued. The church used an artifact, a relic forged from the silver of St. Helena's cross, blessed in the BLD of a true martyr. It was capable of binding the entity within a physical space, preventing its escape. But the artifact was lost. Hawks cursed under his breath. Then tell us where to find another one. The priest sighed, moving toward a rusted, iron-bound chest. He placed his hand on it, whispering a short prayer before slowly prying it open. Inside, buried beneath layers of old velvet, was a single, golden-silver spear tip, its edges glowing faintly. "This is all that remains of the original artifact," Alonzo murmured. "It is not enough to stop her, but it can weaken her." Back in Japan, Nizu's mind was already racing. Then we find a way to use it. Meanwhile, Izumi's endless slaughter. While the heroes scrambled for a solution, Izumi moved effortlessly through the darkened streets of what was once Sapporo, her pale face partially illuminated by the flames of a burning cathedral behind her. A priest crawled at her feet, his hands desperately clutching a small, silver crucifix. His lips trembled as he whispered a final prayer. Izumi knelt beside him, her glowing yellow eyes studying him with an almost childlike curiosity. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she extended her clawed fingers and gently traced them along his cheek. The priest flinched, his breath hitching. "Eureka faith," Izumi whispered, her voice hollow. "But where is your God?" The priest let out a choked sob, his grip tightening on the cross. Izumi tilted her head before pressing a single blackened finger to the center of the cross. The silver instantly melted, turning to dark sludge that dripped between the priest's fingers. His prayer turned into a scream. With an almost playful sigh, Izumi slowly reached out and gripped his skull, her nails piercing into his flesh. She watched as his body convulsed, his mind breaking apart from the sheer presence of her being. Then, a sickening crunch echoed through the empty streets as she snapped his spine like a twig. The body collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Izumi smiled. She liked that sound. And so, she continued walking, searching for the next prayer to silence. Back at HPSC headquarters, the screen cut out, the connection to the Vatican failing momentarily. The room was silent, each hero digesting the truth of what they had just learned. "We have one shot at this," Nizu finally spoke, eyes unreadable. "If we fail to bind her, then there is no stopping her." "And if we succeed?" Best Jeanist asked. Nizu's gaze darkened. "Then we pray the seal holds for eternity." Izumi, watching from the shadows, far from the meeting room, standing in the crimson-lit ruins of a skyscraper, Izumi watched the heroes through the static-filled remnants of a security feed. Her lips curled into a knowing, cruel grin. She had heard everything. "Trying to bind me. Little rodents?" she murmured, tilting her head. "How adorable." Then, without warning, every screen in the ruined building shattered, her presence alone turning the air ice cold. She wasn't going to let them stop her. Not now. Not ever. The last stand. The plan was reckless, desperate, and their only hope. With nearly a third of Japan's population dead, the HPSC and what remained of the hero forces had no choice but to gamble everything on a single strategy: luring Valek into a trap. The Vatican spear tip, infused with the last remnants of St. Helena's cross, had been reforged into a series of binding artifacts. Chains, daggers, and stakes, all meant to hold Valek in place long enough for a permanent seal to be performed. But first, they had to get her there. Ruins of Tokyo, the bait. The ground was littered with bodies. The once proud capital of Japan had become a graveyard, its streets filled with shattered glass, collapsed buildings, and the lingering stench of death. Fires burned unattended, their glow barely illuminating the thick black fog that clung to the ruins like a disease. It was here, in this desolate wasteland, that the heroes would make their final stand. Standing atop the remnants of a crumbling skyscraper, All Might gazed down at the battlefield below, his face grim. His body, long since past its prime, trembled slightly, but his resolve did not waver. Around him stood what was left of Japan's heroes. Endeavor, Hawks, Best Jeanist, Mirko, Kamui Woods, Ryukyu, students from UA and other hero schools. Children who should have never been forced onto this battlefield. But they were all that remained. Is everyone in position? Nizu's voice crackled through the comms. Affirmative, Hawks responded, his usual casual tone gone. Teams Alpha and Beta are hidden along the perimeter. Omega Team is in position with the artifacts. Endeavor exhaled sharply. Then we wait. And they did. Waiting, breathing, praying. Then, the temperature dropped. A sudden, piercing cold swept through the ruins, suffocating the fires and sending icy chills down every hero's spine. The fog thickened, twisting unnaturally, moving like something alive. And then, a faint chuckle echoed through the streets. A laugh that sent pure, primal terror through even the most battle-hardened heroes. She was here. The arrival of death. The first to see her was Mirko. Her rabbit-like reflexes barely gave her time to react as a shadowy figure materialized mere feet away from her, tall, thin, wrapped in the unmistakable flowing black robes of a nun. Glowing yellow eyes burned from beneath the shadowed veil. A predatory grin stretched across her pale, corpse-like face. "Oh, what fun you've prepared for me. Little heroes," Izumi cooed, her voice a mocking whisper. Mirko didn't waste a second. She launched herself forward, aiming a devastating kick at Izumi's skull. For a moment, it looked like she would land the hit. Then Izumi simply vanished. A hand materialized from the fog, behind Mirko, gripping her throat. Before she could react, she was lifted into the air, legs kicking wildly as unseen forces began crushing her windpipe. Mirko's screams came out as gurgled gasps. Now, Izumi murmured, "No need to struggle. I just want to see what breaks first, your bones or your will." Then, a sudden burst of blue fire streaked through the air. Izumi's grip loosened just enough for Mirko to kick herself free, landing roughly on the cracked pavement below. Endeavor stood several feet away, flames roaring around his body, his eyes filled with pure hatred. "Let her go," he growled. Izumi slowly turned to face him. She smiled, and then she lunged. The trap is set. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Izumi moved like a nightmare, phasing in and out of the fog, appearing behind heroes before they could react, breaking bones, slashing flesh, draining their very essence with just a touch. The plan was simple. Lure Valek into the center of the ruins, where Nizu's team had constructed a binding array infused with Vatican holy relics. But executing it was another matter entirely. Heroes were dying. One by one, they fell to Izumi's merciless slaughter. Aizawa tried to use his erasure, but Izumi shattered his eyes before he could even activate his quirk. Hawks attempted a high-speed strike, only for Izumi to pluck his wings off like a child tearing apart an insect. Best Jeanist wrapped fibers around her, only for them to decay upon touching her skin. Nothing worked. Nothing stopped her. And then, Nizu's voice crackled through the comms. Now, at that exact moment, a hidden barrier of silver chains erupted from the ground, forming a massive binding circle around Izumi. Priests hidden in the ruins began chanting, their words filling the air with an almost divine energy. For the first time, Izumi stumbled. She hissed, her black veil burning as the holy energy pressed down on her. "What is this?" she growled, her voice shifting into something demonic. From the shadows, Nizu stepped forward, holding a silver stake infused with the Vatican artifact. "This," Nizu said calmly, "is your end." And with that, the final battle began. A battle against the abyss. The air trembled with energy. The ancient Vatican incantations echoed through the ruins, the sacred words burning into the very fabric of reality. The silver binding chains constricted tighter, the holy relics glowing with an ethereal radiance as they attempted to hold her, to hold Valek. Izumi thrashed against them, her demonic form flickering between solid and incorporeal, twisting through the gaps like a shadow given malice and purpose. "You think this will hold me?" she shrieked, her voice unnatural, reverberating across the ruins. The words were layered, 1,000 tortured voices speaking at once, warping the very air around her. Flames ignited the battlefield as Endeavor charged forward, his entire body blazing hotter than ever before. "We don't think, monster." His voice was hoarse, ragged. "We make it happen." He unleashed a torrent of blue fire, every ounce of his power condensed into a single, unstoppable wave aimed directly at her face. The fire collided, and for the first time, Valek screamed. The holy infused flames seared through her form, black ichor-like Beldi, sizzling in a mist as her veil burned away, exposing her ghastly, skeletal features to the full light of day. Her sunken yellow eyes blazed with pure rage. But she did not fall. Instead, she lunged. Her clawed hands shot forward, grasping Endeavor's face before he could react. The moment her fingers touched his skin, his flames died. A choking gasp escaped his lips as his very life force was drained from him, his powerful body withering in an instant, skin turning pale, veins blackening as Izumi fed. "You burn so brightly," she whispered, almost in admiration. "But your fire belongs to me now." She tightened her grip until a golden blur collided into her with earth-shattering force. All Might's final stand. "I am here." The legendary symbol of peace smashed into Valek with the force of a meteor, driving her backward into the ruins, the ground shattering beneath them. For a brief moment, the entire battlefield froze. Nizu's plan had worked. The ritual was in place, the sacred relics charged, but the only way to ensure Valek's permanent binding was to force her into the very heart of the containment circle. And that required sacrifice. All Might knew this. As he stood, his body trembling, his time long since passed, he turned to look at Endeavor, who barely clung to life, and Best Jeanist, who had stepped beside him. They exchanged no words. There was no need. They all understood. This was where they would fall, and they would make it count. The binding ritual. Valek rose, her form flickering like a dark mirage, her body still smoking from Endeavor's holy flames. She looked at them, and she laughed. A deep, bone-chilling cackle that rippled through the battlefield, sending shudders through every surviving hero. "Is this your final act of defiance?" she mused, tilting her head. "So many have tried before you. So many have prayed to their gods, their faith, their heroes." She stepped forward, and they all fell. All Might clenched his fists. "Maybe," he admitted, "but we only need one victory." And with that, the three legends charged. The last sacrifice. It was a battle of gods and demons. All Might struck first, his weakened form still managing to unleash a devastating Detroit smash that sent Valek hurtling into the heart of the containment circle. Best Jeanist followed, his quirk enhanced with Vatican silver threads, wrapping around Valek's limbs, tightening like holy chains, forcing her down. Endeavor, barely standing, summoned the last of his flames, channeling them into a single condensed sphere, a fire hotter than anything he had ever produced. A fire blessed by faith. Prominence burn. He threw himself forward, slamming the flames directly into her chest. The holy fire ignited within her, her body convulsing violently, inhuman shrieks tearing through the battlefield. She thrashed, clawing at the ground. But the chains held. The barrier closed. And with a final, earth-shaking explosion of energy, All Might, Endeavor, and Best Jeanist vanished. Their bodies erased, their souls sacrificed to complete the ritual. The silver chain solidified, turning into stone, forming an eternal prison. And within it, Valek screamed, trapped, bound, for eternity. The aftermath. The battlefield was silent. The remaining heroes, battered and broken, could only stare at the massive obsidian prison that now stood where Valek had once been. The Vatican priests collapsed in exhaustion, their voices raw from the chanting. Nizu, for once, had no words. They had won, but at what cost? The symbol of peace was gone. The number one hero had fallen. In Japan, Japan was forever scarred. The horror of Valek would never be forgotten. And as the cold wind whispered through the ruins, carrying the faint echoes of a distant, lingering laugh, Nizu couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was only temporary. Years later, the world had moved on, or at least it pretended to. The scars left behind by Valek's reign of terror could still be seen across Japan. Entire cities lay abandoned, overgrown with vines and swallowed by the passage of time. The population, now a shadow of what it once was, had slowly begun the process of rebuilding, but there were places no one dared to tread. One such place was the ruins of Kamakura, the site of Valek's final stand. At the center of this desolate land stood the obsidian prison, an unnatural monolith that pulsed with an eerie, cold presence. It had been sealed with sacred symbols, surrounded by Vatican relics, and watched over by a team of exorcists and top heroes, all ensuring that nothing, absolutely nothing, could escape. But despite their efforts, despite their faith, the whispers never stopped. At first, they were dismissed as tricks of the mind, hallucinations, echoes of the past. The Vatican priests would pray, recite incantations, yet the air remained thick, the shadows longer than they should be. The heroes posted as guards would speak of strange occurrences, reflections moving on their own, faint laughter in the dead of night, the feeling of being watched even when standing under the midday sun. Some simply disappeared, vanished without a trace. Others were found, but not in any condition to speak of what they had seen. And then, one night, the earth trembled. A single crack ran across the surface of the obsidian prison, faint but undeniable. The air grew colder. The Vatican exorcists rushed forward, their holy relics glowing, their voices frantic as they began their incantations. But it was too late. A thin, black mist slithered out of the crack. It moved on its own, twisting like a serpent, spreading through the air like living darkness. One of the priests took a step back, his breathing shallow, his face frozen in horror as a familiar, rasping whisper echoed through the ruins. A whisper that carried a name the world had prayed to never hear again. Valek. And then the shadows deepened, and the nightmare began anew. Thank you for joining us on this journey through what if female Deku became demon. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Random Bullshit 9 for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on Wattpad for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.